green-eyed brunette with olive skin, of German-Russian descent with Swedish roots. That's exactly how the girl who said goodbye to life on August 22, 2018, in Philadelphia, described herself. She was a Playboy, Maxim, and Victoria's Secret model, but apparently her beauty was a serious problem for someone. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Early on a summer morning in 2018, Christina slowly blinked and opened her eyes. Muted sunlight streamed into the room, and her head was pounding from it. The young woman tried with all her might to figure out where she was and how she had ended up there. Fighting the headache and confusion, she began examining the ceiling, the familiar walls, and finally the entire room. She realized she was in her own apartment, exactly where she was supposed to be, but something wasn't right. Christina only had fleeting memories of the previous night at a bar where she had stopped in for just a couple of drinks. She couldn't understand how she had gotten home. She couldn't have been that drunk to forget how a casual outing had ended. But thankfully, she was now home and completely safe. As soon as Christina got out of bed, something else caught her attention. While stumbling around her apartment trying to make sense of this strange morning, she realized that many things were missing. Her credit cards, designer handbags, and jewelry were gone. That's when it hit her. Her apartment had been burglarized, and that triggered an even more terrifying thought. Had she been drugged with something so strong that she passed out and didn't remember being robbed? Someone had deliberately broken into her space and stolen some of her most valuable possessions. What else might have happened while she was unconscious? Along with fear, Christina felt rage. Someone had entered the apartment she considered a safe place and rummaged through it while she lay unconscious in her bed. She had always felt protected in her apartment, but it turned out that wasn't the case. The feeling of fear and panic lingered for several days until Christina finally found the courage to go out into the city again. She was determined to move past this single incident, no matter how terrifying it seemed. She didn't want a burglar to lock her inside four walls. Yet just a few days after her apartment was robbed, Christina herself was found dead in that same bedroom. Christina Carlin Craft lived in Ardmore, a suburb of Philadelphia with a rich history. Though not too far from downtown, the area had a sense of calm. Ardmore also had a lively nightlife, but it felt quieter and safer than the dangers of the big city. Safety and security were what convinced 36-year-old Christina and her fiancé Alex to move to Ardmore, Pennsylvania. Before moving to the sleepy suburb, the young woman's life had been anything but quiet and calm. Christina Carlin Craft was born and raised in New Jersey. While some girls dreamed of a corner office on Wall Street, or a simple life with 2 kids, a loving husband, and a white picket fence, she imagined her beautiful face on the covers of the world's biggest magazines. And although the fashion and entertainment industry crushed the dreams and hopes of millions of young beauties, Christina had everything it took to succeed. Her light green eyes and cascades of dark chestnut hair turned heads, but she had more than just good looks. Her charisma helped her land her dream job, and Christina moved one step closer to the spotlight. Christina Rose Carlin Craft was born on November 11, 1981, in Egg Harbor Township, New Jersey, to Stuart Craft and Dawn Ann Carlin. She had 2 younger brothers and a sister. Their mother tragically died in 1990 when Christina was only 9 and her brother was 7. Her father remarried and had 2 more children, a boy and a girl. The age gap between the oldest and youngest sister was 19 years. The baby was born when Christina had finished high school and was working as a waitress at a casino on the Jersey Shore. Though that job was far from her dreams, it wasn't wasted experience. In mid-2003, the casino received a $1 million investment in hopes of turning it into a luxury resort and attracting crowds of tourists. Christina kept working there when she met the man who would later become the most important person in her life. He was a successful Wall Street banker named Alex Ciccatelli Jr. It was love at first sight. The young couple dove headfirst into a relationship that lasted 14 long years. It wasn't a typical romance. Christina had dreams and wouldn't stop at anything to achieve them. Fortunately, Alex supported her ambitions, and soon, the girl's persistence began to pay off. As a teenager, Christina had modeled several times for some of the world's most famous publications. One of her close friends was Eva. They met during a 3-day photo shoot for Maxim magazine. Both girls were chosen as winners of a modeling contest that featured contestants from around the world. Christina and Eva instantly became friends. After the feature shoot for Maxim, Christina's modeling career took off. Her name became well known in the industry, and she started getting invited to more prestigious shoots. She was living her dream, a loving man and a successful career. What more could she want? Yet there was one goal Christina could never quite reach. It was the pinnacle of a glamour model's career, the way to prove to the world you were worth something and leave your mark on the fashion industry. Carlin Craft desperately wanted to appear in Playboy magazine. At the time, Playboy was an iconic brand. Its bunny head and bow tie logo is still one of the most recognizable trademarks in the world. The logo has been used since the 1950s, and many highly successful actresses and models started their careers by posing for Playboy. Pamela Anderson, Anna Nicole Smith, Jenny McCarthy, the list goes on. Christina was determined to follow in their footsteps. The only problem was that the chance to pose for Playboy came rarely, and the odds of landing a centerfold were practically zero. Playboy had long outgrown being just a men's magazine. It was a full-fledged business with its own clubs, perfume, and even clothing. And in 2005, a popular reality show appeared about the life of Playboy founder Hugh Hefner and his 3 girlfriends. Viewers got a rare glimpse inside the glamorous life, the legendary mansion, extravagant parties thrown for the rich and famous. Playboy had a reputation that went beyond just a company. It was a lifestyle with a certain allure. Christina was one of thousands of women who sent in their photos, praying for a chance at the golden ticket into Playboy's glittering world. Competition for a spot was brutal. You had to compete with countless other stunning girls to make it onto the magazine's pages. And one day it happened for Christina. She was singled out from thousands of others. They saw something special in her. In 2009, she got a call saying she had been chosen as Cyber Girl of the Week. That meant her photos would appear on Playboy's online subscription site, along with a short model bio. On May 4th, 2009, Christina got that opportunity, and she knew it was only the first step. Still, she was on cloud 9 because this shoot gave her an entry ticket into the exclusive Playboy world. Now she could attend all the trendy parties and mingle with Hollywood's most famous people, including Hugh Hefner himself. After all, that man would ultimately decide who got the coveted title. Though Christina posed for the online subscription site and was invited to glamorous parties at the mansion, she was still at the bottom of Playboy's hierarchy. Becoming a playmate meant appearing as a centerfold in the magazine, and only 12 girls a year got that chance. And only one of them received the grand prize, the title of Playmate of the Year, making her the brand's ambassador. Christina would have had a real shot at Playmate of the Year. Her Cyber Girl shoot was stunning. She had striking looks and personality. Only one obstacle stood in her way: age. She was 26 at the time. By most people's standards, she was young, but for a Playboy model, that age was practically ancient. Christina realized she wouldn't get the coveted title, and her time with Playboy ended as quickly as it had begun. The collapse of a dream can leave anyone feeling lost and unsure what to do next. Christina felt abandoned to fate, but she still went looking for a new direction in life. She had dreamed of being a model, and one rejection couldn't destroy those plans. She headed to New York. She went to castings and auditions and received positive feedback about her looks. But no one wanted to work with a model who had posed nude for Playboy. Christina never landed a job, so she decided to move with her fiancé into a luxury apartment he had rented for them near Philadelphia in Ardmore, which had a gym, spacious rooms, and modern appliances. A few minutes' walk away were several pubs and cafes. Unfortunately, Alex was busy with work in New York and couldn't often be with his fiancée. He knew Christina was safe in that apartment, so he left her alone without worry. On Tuesday, August 21st, 2018, Alex left the Ardmore apartment and went to New York for an overnight stay, which was routine for him. He called Christina late that evening to say goodnight, but she didn't answer. That didn't worry him. Alex knew that without him she felt lonely and might go for a walk around town or stop at a restaurant. Night smoothly turned into morning, and Alex still couldn't reach Christina. He called and texted, no reply. Morning turned into day with no response. That's when anxiety settled in his heart. Driven by that feeling, he wrapped up work and rushed to the Ardmore apartment. As he put his key in the lock and pushed, the door wouldn't budge. The key just spun. The lock wouldn't open. Her fiancé thought the apartment must be bolted from the inside. He called his girlfriend again, but Christina still didn't answer calls or messages. Then Alex called the police. It was Wednesday, August 22nd, 2018, 8:55 p.m., when the police department received a request to check on the welfare of an apartment resident. Alex expressed concern for his fiancée, Christina Carlin Craft, explained that he couldn't open the door, and asked them to come urgently. As soon as the officers learned the call was from wealthy Ardmore, they weren't in a hurry. Residents there were known for calling police over the slightest inconvenience, but once Alex gave the exact address, the detectives sprang into action. They had already heard about a recent burglary at that apartment. What if the thief had come back and the burglary had turned into something far more sinister? So the officers wasted no time and rushed to the scene. At the apartment door, they met a distraught Alex, who gave permission to break in. The detectives agreed the situation required immediate action. Using a crowbar, they quickly forced the lock and entered. Opening the front door felt like opening Pandora's box. The moment they stepped inside, they were hit with signs of a horrific, bloody crime. They came face to face with death. None of them expected to see anything like this. Somehow, pushing through the chaos of the living room, the detectives headed to the bedroom and found the worst of it. In the middle of overturned furniture and clothes scattered everywhere was a huge pool of blood and a sheet on the floor. The investigators approached the sheet and already knew what they would find. Carefully lifting a corner, they saw Christina. She lay lifeless on the floor, completely still, her beautiful face mutilated beyond recognition. It was a horrific picture of cuts and bruises. Her hair and head were soaked in blood, and fear was frozen in her eyes. Those stunning green eyes that once captivated adoring fans were now dark and glassy. The brutal attack hadn't spared her delicate nose. It was crushed inward. Judging by the extent of Christina's injuries, it was clear the person who did this was consumed by intense rage. But why would anyone want to harm and kill a joyful girl with a beautiful soul and body? Who could she have crossed in this quiet, peaceful place? Naturally, the fiancé was the first suspect. When the detectives came out and told Alex his fiancé was dead, he collapsed to his knees in shock. He desperately needed answers, but maybe it was all just an act. The percentage of crimes committed by a partner is very high, and almost all of them initially feign grief until evidence turns up against them. Police cordoned off the building with yellow tape, collected surveillance footage from local businesses, and interviewed neighbors. Alex was immediately taken to the station for questioning. It quickly became clear he had absolutely nothing to do with his girlfriend's death. He had been in New York. Alex wasn't faking his pain. He was genuinely devastated by the sudden loss of the woman he loved. With the primary suspect cleared, police turned to the second potential perpetrator, the person responsible for robbing Christina just days before her death. After waking up early and discovering she'd been robbed, Carlin Craft had filed a police report. When the second crime occurred at the same address, detectives were still investigating the burglary. They reviewed surveillance footage they believed could lead to the thief. Christina had said that on August 17th, she went to a bar downtown. But she couldn't remember what happened next. One very important detail should be noted. Statistics show a huge percentage of people aged 18 to 24 have witnessed someone spiking their own or someone else's drink in city bars, and most victims never report it. It's quite possible Christina Carlin Craft had also been given something in her drink. Detectives decided to track how Christina got back to the apartment on camera. It turned out a taxi driver had picked her up from the bar at 3 a.m. He was a black man with facial hair, small mustache and neatly trimmed beard. He was driving a maroon Kia Sorento with Virginia plates captured by traffic cameras. He appeared to be about 30 years old. Footage showed Christina unconscious on the back seat. The taxi driver took keys from her purse and went up to the apartment. He spent over an hour inside before leaving the building with a heavy box. He then woke Christina, supported her by the waist, and walked her home. After that, he grabbed more boxes near the elevator, got in his car, and drove off. Police released the driver's image from surveillance footage, hoping someone would recognize him. Meanwhile, detectives began digging into the details of Christina Carlin Craft's life, looking for clues in her past. First, they checked her online activity and came across a 2016 New York Times article. It reported that Carlin Craft had gotten into an argument with a Manhattan restaurant manager over her bar tab. The dispute escalated so much that police were called because Christina allegedly punched the man in the neck and then kicked him in the groin. She tried to blame the manager, but video showed she was lying and heavily intoxicated. She was arrested and charged with assault. Alex explained that afterward, he and his fiancée went to court and made a deal with the prosecutor to drop all charges on the condition that no similar incidents occurred within 6 months. A year later, they moved to Philadelphia. Alex wanted to protect his girl and felt she would be safer in Ardmore than in the city. Though Christina's life in the new place was comfortable, she missed the city buzz and struggled to adjust to the quiet suburb. She missed company and socializing because Alex was gone for days or weeks at a time for work, so she occasionally went downtown to shop and eat out. Then, of course, detectives discovered Christina's Playboy debut as Cyber Girl of the Week, and the media quickly latched onto that angle. Her untimely death became national news with heavy emphasis on her Playboy history, even though it was only a small part of Carlin Craft's modeling life. She was active on social media, and investigators also found her profile on a site where models showcased their work and posted short resumes. That's where Christina described herself as a green-eyed brunette with olive skin, of German-Russian descent with Swedish roots. She mentioned runway shows, print ads for jewelry and evening gowns, and modeling for Playboy, Maxim, and Victoria's Secret. No leads turned up in Christina's past, unless some crazed fan had killed her. But according to Alex, there were no obsessive people among her acquaintances. Earlier, detectives had traced activity on the stolen credit cards. They had been used at nearby stores the very night they were taken. It was the same taxi driver, as confirmed by store surveillance footage. Fortunately, police were able to identify him because he had prior arrests. His name was Andrea Melton. Police obtained a search warrant for his home and an arrest warrant for burglary early on the morning of August 22nd, just hours before Christina's body was found. Thousands of dollars worth of items stolen from Carlin Craft's apartment were indeed recovered from his home, including designer bags, jewelry, keys, and even the title to a BMW. But unfortunately, Andrea himself was nowhere to be found. Detectives theorized that since this man knew exactly where Christina lived and how to get in, he might have returned to eliminate a witness who could identify him. The burglary investigation became far more urgent because now it involved a much more serious crime. Meanwhile, Christina's autopsy report showed several broken facial bones, but the cause of death was determined to be ligature strangulation. The killer had used something like a cord or rope as the weapon. While investigators pored over hours of surveillance footage frame by frame, they found something. Early on the morning before the tragedy, Christina left the building alone. She appeared again on camera, walking unsteadily back home around 3 a.m. But this time, she wasn't alone. She was arm in arm with an unknown man. He had the same skin tone as Andrea, similar height and age. He wore a leather jacket and white jeans, with a white bandana on his head. But it wasn't Andrea. It was a different man. Carlin Craft and the stranger entered the apartment building together. The security system recorded when the apartment door opened, but it never opened again after that. However, at 5:19 a.m., the balcony sliding door was recorded opening. Christina's apartment was on the first floor, but elevated to second-floor height. Investigators believed the killer could have escaped by jumping over the balcony railing. The height made it easy. Whatever happened, after those two entered the building, one person died and the other became the subject of a nationwide manhunt. The footage was very clear thanks to the building's high-tech surveillance system. Police were able to print stills of the man escorting Christina that night and distribute them to the media, hoping someone would recognize him. Detectives still didn't know if there was any connection between the man on video and Andrea Melton. Meanwhile, more and more news outlets broadcast the sordid story of the Playboy model killed in her luxury apartment. Headlines screamed only about her past with the famous magazine, forgetting that besides that, she was also an ordinary person with her own weaknesses and desires. But it did have one positive effect. On August 23rd, just one day after the tragedy, the lead detective received a phone call. It was Andrea Melton, who had seen his own photo in the news linked to the popular model's death. Andrea wanted to clear things up. He admitted he had robbed Carlin Craft's apartment, but had nothing to do with her murder. He wasn't planning to turn himself in and be blamed for something he didn't do. Of course, no one took Andrea at his word. They kept looking for him as well as the second man caught on camera. They suspected Andrea might have given Christina's address to a friend who, for some reason, carried out the killing. Soon police got a tip from a key witness, a taxi driver who said he had picked up the girl and the man shown in the news photos that night. He got the impression they were romantically involved. Neither looked upset or scared. They were laughing and chatting sweetly. Christina hadn't used a ride-sharing app. She simply asked the driver to take them home because some guys on the street were harassing her. She promised to pay cash once they got to Ardmore. But when it was time to pay, she said she had no cash on her. The second passenger offered the driver $100 if he'd wait 15 minutes outside. The stranger said he'd walk her to the door, make sure she was safe, and come right back. It wasn't a great situation, and the driver knew he might get stiffed, but he felt he had no choice since he'd taken the fare without the app. He waited outside the building, and after half an hour, realized no one was coming to pay him and drove off. This information clarified the picture a bit, but police still didn't know the name of the man Christina was with that night. Then, on August 26th, another caller claimed to recognize the wanted man as his former psychiatric ward neighbor. A few days earlier, they had been in a Philadelphia psychiatric clinic together. The mystery man had been admitted after kicking a woman. He was ordered to undergo a 72-hour psychiatric evaluation. The caller told detectives about a disturbing conversation he'd had with the suspect. The man bragged that he had strangled a woman to death, and that there was nothing better than squeezing someone's throat and watching the life leave their body. It was clear this person might be directly connected to Carlin Craft's death and needed to be stopped before he hurt anyone else. But police were disappointed again. The suspect had been admitted as John Doe, an unknown person. His real name wasn't in any paperwork. And when detectives arrived at the clinic, the man had already been discharged. 4 days had passed since the investigation began. Detectives worked late, considering every possible scenario, but the case was still at a dead end. They hadn't even managed to arrest Andrea Melton, who had robbed Carlin Craft's apartment. Christina's family desperately needed answers. Not only had they lost a loved one, but the media was trying to portray the girl in a bad light. Relatives wanted the public to know Christina as more than just a Playboy model. They talked about how kind, generous, and caring she was. Reporters, however, latched onto only the loud and compromising facts of her biography. But every person has both good and bad traits. On August 29th, the funeral was held. The body of 36-year-old Christina Carlin Craft was brought to New Jersey, where she grew up. That same day, police received another call. A woman identifying herself as the suspect's sister gave his name, Jonathan Wesley Harris. She said he was 31 and had prior convictions for robbery and drug distribution. He had been released from prison just 5 weeks before Christina's death. Now all that remained was to find him. He had gone on the run. Police interviewed friends, acquaintances, family members, everyone who might know Jonathan Harris's whereabouts. Eventually, they learned the suspect had left Philadelphia on a bus headed to Pittsburgh. Detectives contacted Pittsburgh authorities and warned them a potential killer was heading their way. He was violent and dangerous and needed to be apprehended as soon as possible. Pittsburgh officers quickly formed a task force and went to the bus station to try to intercept him. They had an approximate arrival time, so they surrounded the terminal and blocked all exits so the suspect couldn't escape. When the bus pulled in, the task force identified Jonathan Harris among the passengers using his photo and successfully arrested him. During the arrest, he tried to give police a fake name. Now, all that was left for detectives was to find out what happened in those few short hours between Harris and Carlin Craft after they entered the apartment. Jonathan was shown a photo of the girl and asked how he knew her. He claimed they struck up a conversation at a local bar. Christina complained to her new acquaintance about how lonely she was in the suburbs and how she missed the party atmosphere and socializing. Harris said they were both under the influence of alcohol and drugs, so they decided to go to Christina's apartment to continue hanging out. Jonathan said that night he had given her cocaine on the condition that she pay him once they got to her place. Once inside, they drank a couple bottles of wine and then had consensual sex. When Harris was about to leave and demanded payment for the drugs they had used, Christina refused to pay. The amount was significant, $1,200, and after the refusal, a verbal argument broke out. Christina grabbed a wine bottle and smashed it over his head while he was naked. Blood poured from his ear, and she kept screaming for him to get out. Jonathan lost control and slapped her. She fell to the floor and passed out. But according to Harris, she was alive when he left, just very drunk. The story might have seemed plausible, if not for several inconsistencies. First, the toxicology report showed alcohol in Christina's blood, but no trace of illegal drugs. Second, if Jonathan hadn't killed her, who had that same night after their fight? Detectives made it clear to Harris they didn't believe him and left him alone in the interrogation room to think about what was coming. The realization that he could spend the rest of his life behind bars made him change his story a bit. Those few minutes alone clearly stirred something in him, because when the investigators returned, Jonathan told a version much closer to the truth. Harris admitted that he and Christina had gotten into a physical fight over money. He expected cash, but she thought sex was payment enough for the drugs. After he hit her in the face, Christina quickly regained consciousness and started screaming. Jonathan tried to calm her, but she kept shrieking. To quiet her, he punched her in the chest and then tied her up with pajama pants. Harris claimed he didn't want to hurt her. He just wanted to leave. Seeing fear in the helpless, naked woman's eyes, he untied her and begged her to be quiet. Christina agreed, but the moment she was free, she jumped off the bed and tried to run to the front door. Harris grabbed her and threw her back onto the bed, and then something animalistic took over him. He started punching her in the face over and over, intending to knock her out. When she went still, he rummaged through her things looking for money but found nothing. Christina started breathing strangely and asked him to bring her phone. She said she was okay and needed to call her dad. but instead tried to dial 911. Jonathan panicked, snatched the phone, and squeezed Christina's neck with all his strength. He assured police he saw her still breathing after that, but no longer resisting. Then he covered her body with a sheet so he wouldn't have to see what he'd done. He changed into clothes he found in the closet because his white pants were soaked in blood, and he left through the balcony door so he wouldn't be caught on camera, just as investigators had suspected. No matter how brutal the crime, Jonathan insisted he never meant to hurt Christina. He said he panicked, was scared, didn't know what to do. That's why he covered her with the sheet so he wouldn't see her battered face. He knew she was in a lot of pain and badly injured, but heavy drugs had clouded his mind at the time. Jonathan Harris confessed to killing Christina but pleaded not guilty. He claimed it was all unintentional. Later, his lawyers didn't deny that their client had strangled Carlin Craft to death, but argued it was accidental. The defense asked the jury to convict him of third-degree murder, which would carry a much lighter sentence. However, his bragging to the psychiatric ward neighbor completely contradicted his claims and showed that Harris enjoyed taking a life. He could have stopped the attack. He had plenty of time to calm down. He could have left her tied up or simply fled after she first lost consciousness. He could have turned himself in when he became wanted. He could have made a different choice that wouldn't have stolen a young woman's life and left her family in grief and despair. But instead, he chose to run. The jury must have felt the same as Christina's family because they found Harris guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Christina's fiancé, Alex, addressed Jonathan in court, calling him a coward and saying that he not only took the life of a kind, loving, amazing person everyone misses terribly, he caused unnecessary pain to those who loved her, all for no reason. Moreover, he continued to slander Christina's name even after her death by claiming she used drugs. Alex had lived with her for 14 years and knew her better than anyone. It's impossible to imagine what that girl went through. She missed her old lifestyle and wanted the feeling of parties, crowds, and connection. That night she met the wrong man and had no idea what he was capable of. Jonathan Harris was an extremely dangerous person and should never have been released from the psychiatric hospital. He clearly deserves to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Christina Carlin Craft was more than just a model. She was a driven, ambitious young woman who drew people in with her charisma and personality. She loved her family and adored animals. As her father, Stuart Craft, said, she was the brightest ray of light. And though her life was cut short, the warmth from that light lives on in the hearts of everyone who loved her. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. In 1990, in the small farming community of Soledad in Central California, a makeshift trailer camp, where mostly poor or unlucky vagrants lived, began to turn into something frightening. This is the bloody story of Gerald Cruz's cult. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Gerald Cruz was born in March 1962. He grew up in Modesto, California, in a very unstable family. The boy's parents constantly argued and even fought, so Gerald's childhood could not be called happy. He was in a toxic environment where adults spoke in raised voices and showed no care for their own son, which led to several quite serious injuries. When the baby was only 6 months old, he was dropped headfirst right onto the concrete porch. At 4 years old, Gerald was riding with his mom in the car in the front seat. He wasn't buckled in with a seatbelt. The mother, who was driving, braked sharply, and the child flew through the windshield onto the asphalt. By some miracle, the boy survived. In his childhood years, Gerald didn't understand much at all. In fact, he didn't even know who his real parents were. At that time, the child lived with his mom, dad, and older sister Hope, who was 26 years old. But in reality, everything was different. Hope was not Gerald's older sister, but his biological mother, and the one he thought was his mom was actually his grandmother. And Gerald had no idea about this terrible family secret until some kind people enlightened him. Hope gave birth to her son at a fairly young age, without being married. For some reason, the family decided to hide this fact. One day at school, someone let it slip that Hope wasn't Gerald's sister, but his real mother. The boy was shocked to his core. Naturally, upon coming home, the first thing the child did was rush to his parents and start asking uncomfortable questions. Instead of explaining the situation somehow, the mother yelled at her son and said that it was all a lie and she had no intention of talking about it. The boy was forced to figure out the overwhelming information on his own. Gerald remained in complete confusion for many more years, and from childhood believed that all of life consisted of lies. Over time, the situation at home only got worse. The parents, who had taken on the responsibility of raising the boy, clearly couldn't handle it, but they weren't going to change. They took out their dissatisfaction on their son, subjecting him to terrible abuse. Every time Gerald misbehaved, his grandmother would grab whatever object came to hand and physically punish the child. She whipped him with a cane, a piece of rope, a metal wire, an umbrella, a clothes hanger, a stick, anything at all. Around the same time, Gerald began to be bullied at school. He was teased because of his appearance, his funny hairstyle, his unkempt clothes. He had no friends at all. The boy constantly suffered from loneliness. He felt very uncomfortable at school, but at home, Gerald didn't feel safe either, spending his days locked in his bedroom. Overall, the Cruz family was strange. The neighbors didn't like them, and no one ever came to visit. The boy was also forbidden from bringing anyone into the house. The parents' cruelty extended not only to their son. The mother was such an inadequate person that one day she got angry at the neighbor's dog because it wandered into her yard. In revenge, the woman grabbed an axe and chopped off the dog's hind leg. It became clear that in such a family, a normally mentally healthy child was unlikely to grow up. The toxic atmosphere in the house left its mark on Gerald. After finishing school, the 18-year-old Cruz left his parental home. He finally escaped from his insane, cruel family. However, it was at this very time that Gerald had a serious personality crisis. He never really knew who his parents were. He guessed that his sister Hope was actually his biological mother, although no one ever explained it to him. Everyone just ignored the situation. But now, what bothered Gerald more was who his biological father was and why his father had abandoned him. Tangled up in all these oddities, the guy felt rejected and unwanted by anyone. He still had no friends, and he began to get angry at the whole world. An outcast with no purpose in life, he was a stranger everywhere. Gerald Cruz developed a huge distrust of authorities and the entire structure of society. He felt that the system had failed him, so deep down, he cherished a desire for revenge. He was filled with destructive feelings. To earn a living, Gerald got a job as a bouncer in a strip club and worked there every night. He met a lot of unfamiliar people there who were very similar to him. They all felt resentment toward those around them because they didn't fit into the accepted norms. People who had no friends or family, people who were in despair, who had no job, no home of their own, and were simply rejected by society. Gerald finally felt that he wasn't the only one like that. He became interested in talking to strangers, discussing the government, and cursing the system. Surprisingly, the guy easily and quickly found common ground with such people. This was the first time in his life that he didn't feel lonely. Most of Gerald's new acquaintances were regular customers of the club. They liked chatting with the bouncer, listening to his rants. Many were enchanted by him and agreed with his judgments. Gerald suddenly realized that he could be quite charismatic and charming. After all, barely acquainted people hung on his every word, and he had never experienced anything like it before. As usually happens, The new feeling immediately went to the guy's head. Being in the center of attention and possessing some kind of power, Gerald became incredibly narcissistic. He had never had friends before, and now his opinion was considered authoritative by several people at once. The young man felt the power he possessed. His personality began to change. Gerald Cruz became incredibly arrogant, narcissistic, and overconfident, just like cult leaders usually are. Among his new friends who hung on his every word, Gerald met a man who played a very important role in today's case. This was a person named James Beck, who essentially became Cruz's right-hand man, his bodyguard. James Beck was born in 1956. He was about 6 years older than Gerald. James grew up in a very religious family. He was a member of the church choir and went to church every Saturday and Sunday. Beck knew the Bible from cover to cover. By his youth, James had experienced psychological trauma. When the guy was 17, his father was caught sexually abusing his sisters. The criminal was sent to prison, but it affected James in the most negative way. Now he felt real hatred and resentment toward his father. Nevertheless, when Beck was already over 20, he got married and had 3 children. But then, his wife became addicted to illegal drugs, started drinking a lot, and couldn't fully care for the kids. In the end, James divorced, got full custody of the children, and moved in with them to live at his mother's and stepfather's house. Before separating from his wife, he was a good guy, a great family man, a caring father to his children. However, the divorce completely changed him. The resentment toward his wife turned into anger at all of society as a whole. James started visiting the local strip club more often, where he met Gerald Cruz. The two immediately found common ground. They had a lot in common. Anger, the desire to destroy the system, and blaming everyone but themselves for their own problems. James Beck was described as a natural follower. He didn't really like making decisions on his own, and finding someone like Gerald was the ideal solution for him. Beck believed everything Cruz said and practically idolized him. And Gerald, in turn, began filling James's head with all sorts of nonsense. Over time, the men started meeting more often. Cruz began turning Beck against his family. He said that family was abuse for him, that he needed to free himself from these chains. And James, being a complete idiot, began following the words of his new friend. He started spending less time with his children, whom he once loved and was devoted to. His personality completely changed. Just a few weeks after meeting Gerald, James stopped attending church, although he used to do it every weekend. From childhood, Beck had been very religious, but after spending about a month with Cruz, he stopped believing in God. He became sullen, angry, and now was completely under Gerald's control. It all started with these two, Gerald and his right-hand man, James. The men decided that to destroy the system and change society, they needed a large group of people. So they began looking for followers, those who thought like them. Mostly, these were regulars at the strip club. Many of them were experiencing financial difficulties or were simply very vulnerable people. So Gerald invited them to his house, held secret meetings, and essentially preached to them that he could radically change their lives. Gerald continued working as a bouncer in the strip club, but now he was more focused. He had a goal for which the man was ready to do anything. As a control tactic, Cruz invited new acquaintances to live at his house, gave them a place to sleep and hot food. After some time, these people began to look at Gerald as their savior. In their eyes, he was a selfless guy, ready to change the world for the better. In addition, not only visitors, but also other club employees followed Gerald. Bouncers, bartenders, rock band members, even some of the dancers. Then a local dentist, a law student, and even a pastor who believed Gerald's words joined the group. They all followed Cruz because they were united by one common trait. They felt like outcasts. Soon, the number of Gerald's followers grew to 55 people. The cult members met on a regular basis. Cruz, as the cult leader, using a mixture of ideology and white supremacy with various satanic rituals, systematically brainwashed these people. This story unfolded at the height of the Satanic Panic, a social phenomenon of the 1980s when many talked about the existence of a large-scale satanic conspiracy. And Gerald used this to his advantage, imposing various magical practices on the group. He made everyone wear white clothes and gather in dark rooms, where they then danced and sang, surrounded by candles. Then, as befits a cult leader, Gerald told his followers that he had special abilities. Without any modesty, he declared that he could communicate directly with God and talk to spirits, and that he would pass on important messages from them. Then Cruz went even further in his fantasies. He began conducting voodoo rituals and ceremonies that were supposed to demonstrate his magical abilities. He called himself a high priest and cast curses. The most amazing thing was that people listened to all this nonsense and believed everything their leader said. At some point, the 25-year-old Gerald realized that he was now the leader, and he needed a wife. As a partner, he chose a 16-year-old girl named Jennifer Self. And this choice was not random. Due to her age and character, Jennifer was incredibly vulnerable, and it was easy to manipulate her, which Cruz took advantage of. Soon, Jennifer joined the group of followers as the leader's girlfriend. It wasn't hard for the adult guy to charm the teenager and promise her all the blessings of the world on the condition that she would be with him. It wasn't even a couple of months before the girl fell in love with Gerald and moved in with him, and then came the news of her pregnancy. Unfortunately for Jennifer, her life rapidly went downhill from the moment she joined the group. Like most cult leaders, Gerald wasn't satisfied with one girlfriend. He wanted to have several wives. At that time, his right-hand man James was dating a girl named Rosemary for several years already. She worked as a dancer in the strip club. One day, Gerald approached James and said straight out, "I want your girl to become my wife." Any sane person would have refused his friend such an idea. But James was 100% loyal to Gerald, so he agreed. The man approached Rosemary and said that she had no choice but to become Gerald's wife. Moreover, he convinced his girlfriend that this was the right decision, and Rosemary apparently agreed. Most likely, Gerald, being an all-powerful being, simply declared Jennifer and Rosemary his wives. It's unlikely that he entered into an official marriage with either of them. Meanwhile, the number of cult members continued to grow. Gerald stuck to the same tactic and chose the most vulnerable people. The man wanted to feel as special as possible. At that time, Cruz lived in a trailer park in the farming community of Soledad, California. As more and more people joined the group, Gerald set up 2 additional trailers on his lot. Now many of Cruz's adherents lived in a small commune on the trailer park grounds, like one big family. All followers who had jobs had to give their earned money to the head of the family, Gerald. Only he could dispose of it, although these were common resources. There were rules in the group that had to be followed. People were strictly forbidden from communicating with anyone outside the cult, as they might slip out of control. Gerald even gave a name to his group of followers, the Order of the Lion, or the Camp. The camp was supposed to mark the beginning of a new stage in human development. Cruz and his adherents actually believed that they could change something in society, although, in essence, they did nothing for it. They just lived by made-up rules and treated Cruz like an adoptive father. In their eyes, he had completely turned their lives around. They had a purpose, even if it was vague. Once despised by everyone, Gerald turned out to be so charismatic and charming that he instilled in the heads of several dozen people that he was special. And the followers were ready to do anything for him. However, the larger the group became, the harder it was to control. So Cruz recruited a couple more people into his camp who were to become his main victims in the future. The first was a 15-year-old teenager named Richard, or Ricky Vieira. Like most people in the camp, Ricky had a difficult childhood. His father taught him to mess around with weed when the boy was only 8 years old. And from then on, Ricky developed a serious addiction. He was suspended from classes several times for possessing illegal drugs. And then Ricky dropped out of school altogether and found refuge in Cruz's group. The second significant person whom Gerald recruited into his camp was a young 20-year-old man named Stephen Perkins. He came to the group on the recommendation of James Beck, the leader's right-hand man, who was a friend of the Perkins family and had known Stephen since childhood. From the very beginning, Gerald wanted to make these two guys an example for the other members of the community. He used them to instill fear in everyone else. Cruz treated Ricky and Stephen horribly. They had to stay constantly on the campgrounds to distance themselves from their families, and they were allowed to visit relatives only with written permission from Gerald, which happened very rarely. But even when they managed to see their family, the visit was completely controlled by the cult leader. For example, Ricky and Stephen, while at their parents' house, couldn't even sit down at the table and have dinner until they got permission from Gerald. Mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters worried about the condition of the young people, who were turning into shadows of their former selves and wasting away before their eyes. Ricky and Stephen became very withdrawn, capricious, and constantly showed dissatisfaction. Both men lost a lot of weight, over 50 kilograms each in a year. They constantly had some injuries, cuts on their hands, split lips, and bruises under their eyes. The guys shuddered at the slightest sound. Their families begged Ricky and Stephen to leave Gerald, but each time the young people refused and returned to the camp. They were so afraid of Cruz that they were ready to sacrifice themselves. Gerald and James abused Stephen and Ricky, controlling every aspect of their lives. What they ate, how often they showered, how much they slept, and who they talked to. Cruz demanded complete obedience from both. He made them do all the household chores in the camp, cook food, clean, and simply serve others. Stephen and Ricky also had to babysit the children, and at night the young people had to guard the camp from outsiders. As a result, the guys experienced severe sleep deprivation. They had hallucinations, and mental health problems began. If one of them broke the rules, Gerald made the offender stand in the corner with his hands raised above his head, while James Beck delivered painful blows to their stomachs. Gerald himself didn't lift a finger to maintain discipline in the camp. He never physically abused anyone, delegating it to someone else. Most often, the executor was James, his right-hand man. James always blindly carried out any command from Gerald. He liked slapping Ricky and Stephen, kicking them, punching them, or hitting them with the first object that came to hand. Beatings were not uncommon. Sometimes Ricky and Stephen could barely move after such physical punishments. However, James came up with even more sophisticated tortures for them. One day, he made Stephen lie naked on the ground while he kicked him in the genitals. After the tortures, the young people were tied up and left in a dark room. Physical punishment was inflicted not only on these two men, but also on the so-called wives. Gerald often beat the young Jennifer with a cane, and Rosemary was beaten by her former boyfriend, James. If the women resisted, a gun was shoved into their mouths, and they were threatened with death. After that, they lost any desire to contradict Gerald and James. One day, Rosemary still tried to escape, but Beck and several other cult members caught up with her, brought her back to the camp, and brutally beat her. Gerald told the woman that if she ever left the territory without permission again, he would chop off her head and keep it as a trophy. This went on for some time until Cruz got bored with the beatings and decided to toughen the punishment. Gerald called it electroshock therapy. First, he bought a stun gun and made James use it on Ricky and Stephen. Then the tortures became even more sophisticated. Cruz cut an extension cord in half, stripped the electrical wires, then wrapped them around Stephen's toes and stuck them under the skin. Plugging the cord into the outlet, the cult leader watched as the guy twitched, rolled on the floor, and screamed in pain. The young man's toes were covered in burns and inflamed. The entire foot turned black. Gerald found it hilarious. For him, it was a kind of entertainment because he tortured Stephen again and again. For some reason, Cruz felt a great dislike precisely for this young man. All this was done only to intimidate the other cult members and make them obey the leader unquestioningly. The other camp residents didn't want to experience Gerald's wrath on themselves, so they obediently did everything they were told. But it doesn't happen that everyone is equally obedient, so Gerald developed a new control tactic, the Wheel of Punishment. It was like a Wheel of Fortune, only instead of prizes, the wheel's sectors had various punishments. Gerald made the camp residents toss the wheel into the air and then catch it with their thumb and index finger, thereby choosing a card for themselves. If at first everything was restrained, making the offenders eat food off the floor or strip naked, then later it escalated into sexual assaults. People were forced to perform sexual acts in front of others, regardless of their gender. As a lever of influence, Gerald made all members of his group fill out personal diaries where people talked about their biggest fears and phobias. Cruz needed this to skillfully manipulate them in case of disobedience. Slowly but surely, this man was turning into a tyrant. Stephen Perkins suffered the most from his tyranny. His punishments became increasingly cruel, and one day the guy couldn't take it and tried to commit suicide. Stephen got on a motorcycle, accelerated, and crashed into a wall at high speed. After the accident, the young man ended up in the hospital with multiple broken ribs, a shattered sternum, a punctured spleen, and a head injury. Fortunately, he survived the accident, but his mental state left much to be desired. After being discharged from the hospital, Stephen returned to his parents' house, where he made another suicide attempt. In the end, he was referred to a psychiatrist, and he finally got the help he needed. After a course of therapy, Stephen Perkins left the cult and forgot about Gerald Cruz like a bad dream. In fact, he wasn't the only one who left the camp. Many followers, having had enough of Cruz's ramblings about his magical abilities, simply stopped attending meetings. If the cult's membership previously exceeded 50 people, now the number of followers sharply decreased. Among those who fled was one of Gerald's wives, Rosemary. This meant that the leader was starting to lose control. He didn't think it was time to change something. He just got angry and took out his anger on his second wife, the young Jennifer. She had previously given birth to 2 children for Cruz and was now pregnant with a third. She was only 18 years old. While Jennifer was pregnant, Gerald didn't stop abusing her. When she escaped to a women's shelter, the man began tormenting their 6-month-old daughter, locking her in a dark room for several hours at a time. Just a few days later, Jennifer returned to the camp. She feared for her own life, but couldn't allow Gerald to abuse the little daughter. In the end, the young woman was beaten every time she stood up for her daughter. Cruz allowed Jennifer to change and feed the child every 6 hours, and the rest of the time forbade her from approaching the daughter. This was the worst of the ordeals, to hear the baby crying but not be able to protect her. Gerald, on the other hand, found it amusing when he and James sneaked into the child's room while she was sleeping and yelled at the top of their lungs, scaring the girl into hysterics. They even recorded themselves on video and re-watched the recording for their own entertainment. The baby got so used to pain and fear that every time she saw her father, she fell to the floor and covered her head with her hands. It became an instinct for her. There is no confirmation, but it was said that Gerald also molested his children. However, this man got away with everything. The camp, where cult members were cruelly punished, was located on the grounds of a trailer park where other people lived who had nothing to do with the cult. Although the commune hardly bothered the people living nearby, the local residents still felt uncomfortable. Some even reported to the police about the outrages happening in the 3 trailers where Gerald's followers lived. But for some reason, the authorities did nothing, and until a certain point, the camp had no problems with the law. To maintain his authority and somehow strengthen his leadership, Gerald announced to his followers that the end of the world was coming soon and that they needed to prepare for it. When the time came, they would have to overthrow the government. For this, the people in the camp began stocking up on weapons, guns, knives, explosives, collecting materials for explosive devices, and studying instructions on how to make them. Gerald Cruz's cult was turning into a dangerous organization. It seemed like they were planning large-scale events. The camp members began committing burglaries on neighbors and leaving threatening notes behind. But the police never connected these notes and burglaries to the cult. Gerald and his followers once again avoided punishment for their actions. In January 1990, about 7 to 8 years after the cult's inception, a man named Franklin Raper joined the camp. The man brought his trailer to the complex grounds and joined the commune along with several of his friends. Franklin was about 50 years old and was the complete opposite of Gerald. He had good intentions and a desire to help people, but unlike Cruz, Raper did it sincerely. He provided shelter to the homeless, free of charge, out of the goodness of his heart. Franklin wasn't a manipulator, didn't demand money, didn't punish anyone. He was just a good person. Having joined Gerald's cult, Franklin began helping other camp members who were more vulnerable. People immediately felt the difference and started turning more often not to Gerald, but to Franklin. Naturally, Cruz sensed a threat to his power. He was afraid that Raper might overthrow him. Tension arose between the men as Franklin felt neither fear nor threat from the group's authoritative leader. The tension spilled over into arguments and scandals. Threats sometimes escalated into fights, and this went on for 4 months. Finally, Gerald decided to take matters into his own hands. After one of the quarrels, he ordered his close associates to drag Franklin's trailer off the mobile home park grounds and then set Raper's car on fire, thereby expressing his attitude toward him. When Franklin discovered what Gerald had done, he said he would come to him in the evening to kill him. But when May 20th, 1990 arrived, events took a completely different turn. Gerald gathered 5 of his most loyal friends from the cult, including James Beck, Jason LaMarche, Ronald Y., and 21-year-old Ricky Vera, who had been subjected to torture and punishment since he was 15. Also among the 4 men was a woman named Michelle Evans, whom Cruz had recruited earlier. Michelle communicated with Franklin more than others, so she described the interior layout of the trailer to Gerald. Her task was to lure everyone in the house into one room. Gerald decided to kill Franklin and everyone who was with him in the trailer. He handed out weapons, knives, and bats, as well as masks to hide their faces. And the deadly mission began. First, Michelle entered the trailer alone around midnight. She asked everyone to gather in the living room. At that moment, in the house, besides Franklin, there was a man named Dennis Caldwell, a man named Richard Ritchie, and a woman named Darlene Paris. As soon as everyone was in one room, 4 men in camouflage burst into the trailer. From that moment, real hell began. Gerald headed straight for Franklin and began hitting him on the head with a bat. At that time, the woman next to him started screaming and begging to spare her life. Ricky Vieira, on Cruz's order, grabbed her by the hair and hit her several times, then slit her throat with such force that he practically decapitated her. James Beck was fighting with one of the men at that time. Gerald beat Franklin so badly that he had teeth knocked out and a broken arm. Blood was everywhere, and the carnage was brutal and insane. Real chaos was happening in the trailer. On top of everything, Cruz's followers cut the electricity, so the attack was a complete surprise for those in the house. At some point, the 4th victim, Richard Ritchie, managed to run out of the trailer, but one of Gerald's buddies followed him and immediately killed him. Other people living in the trailer park witnessed the brutal attack. They called the police, but by the time the patrol cars arrived, it was already too late. The attack lasted only a few minutes. Then the masked bandits fled, leaving behind 4 corpses. The first victim, Richard Ritchie, lay on the grass near the trailer. He received multiple stab wounds to the neck, back, and abdomen, as well as wounds sustained in self-defense. Any of these injuries could have led to his death. Inside the trailer, they found Dennis Caldwell. He had a fractured skull and numerous stab wounds all over his body. Next to him lay Darlene Paris. The cause of her death was a slit throat, as a result of which the woman almost lost her head. And finally, in the back of the room, they found Franklin Raper, who had sustained extensive fatal head trauma from baseball bat blows. His face was completely deformed, and bone fragments penetrated deep into the brain. The trailer owner also had a broken left arm and knocked out teeth. All these people died as a result of the brutal attack. The authorities immediately began an investigation, and almost right away, there was an unexpected turn in the case that Gerald's cult members didn't expect at all. A surviving witness remained in the trailer. When Michelle Evans, on Cruz's order, gathered everyone in the living room, she didn't know that a woman was sleeping in one of the rooms. This woman was named Donna Alvarez. She was homeless, and Franklin Raper had offered her a place to sleep. When the attack began, Donna heard the noise, jumped out the window, and hid in the bushes nearby. She saw the attackers leave the trailer, and then one of them pulled off his mask. As soon as the criminals were out of sight, Donna ran to the neighbors and called the 911 emergency service. Fortunately, she was able to describe one of the attackers, a man whom the authorities quickly identified as camp member Jason LaMarche. After thoroughly studying the suspect's identity, they found out that he was part of the commune led by Gerald Cruz and lived in the nearby trailer park. Investigators visited Cruz's trailer. Gerald denied his involvement in the massacre, but named several members of his group. During the search, detectives found many alarming pieces of evidence, including materials for making bombs, masks, a receipt for buying knives, and satanic literature. In the end, Gerald Cruz was arrested for possessing explosives. He claimed that on that night, he was outside the city with his followers, Ricky Vieira and James Beck, who were soon detained as well. The investigators considered the 21-year-old Ricky the weak link and were right. Soon, the guy told how cruelly he was treated in the camp, recounted all the abuses he had suffered from Gerald over all these years, and then confessed to the police that Cruz had indeed planned the attack on Franklin Raper's trailer. In addition, Ricky named all those who participated in it. 6 days after the massacre, the authorities tracked down and arrested Jason LaMarche. To save his skin, the man immediately began shifting the blame for what was done onto the others. Soon, all 5 attackers were arrested and found guilty. Michelle Evans was charged with aiding and abetting, and, in exchange for testimony against the 5 men, was sentenced to only 1 year in prison. Jason LaMarche and Ronald Y. were sentenced to 62 years in prison. The cult leader Gerald Cruz and his right-hand man James Beck and Ricky Vieira were sentenced to death. To this day, they are on death row. As soon as Gerald went to prison, the remaining cult members left the camp. The man who possessed extraordinary charisma and could lead a crowd wasted his life senselessly and will now spend the rest of his days behind bars. His malice resulted in the death of 4 innocent people. However, it is unknown what other terrible plans Gerald Cruz was hatching in his sick head, dreaming of breaking the system in the future. Perhaps Franklin Raper and his friends, with their deaths, saved a much larger number of lives. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. The story of Mary Collins's disappearance during the pandemic shocked many, especially given the obvious cruelty of her tormentors and their calculated attempt to hide her body. However, the tragedy attracted less attention than one might expect. Jealousy is an expression of one's own insecurity, but sometimes jealousy transforms into one of the most dangerous emotions, which can take over the mind, provoke anger, and escalate from passive aggression to stalking, violence, and an obsession with control. Irrational jealousy can even lead to a crime, and neither material wealth nor a seemingly perfect life guarantees freedom from this feeling. It was jealousy that was to blame for what happened to the unique girl named Mary Collins. She was betrayed by a group of people she considered her friends. Her positive outlook on life made her special, but at the same time vulnerable to others. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. 20-year-old Mary Santino Collins was born on July 6, 1999, in the family of Casey Del Pezzo. Santino means saint in Italian, and this word perfectly described Mary's sweet personality. She was magnificent with an otherworldly gaze. Her eyes gave her the appearance of an unreal being. Thick hair, which she loved to dye in bright colors, complemented her creative imagination. In childhood, Mary lived with her grandparents Mia and William Olderman. They had a more stable household to provide her with everything necessary, and her mom and aunt helped take care of her. They had a large, friendly family surrounding the girl with love and care. Around 3 months old, her grandmother noticed that Mary had difficulty eating, didn't make eye contact, and didn't recognize herself in mirrors. For almost 3 years, Mia took Mary to doctors, trying to figure out the cause of her granddaughter's strange behavior. The girl was diagnosed with what is known as 22q deletion syndrome. This is a genetic disorder capable of affecting any system in the body, so it manifests differently in each patient. It was also discovered that Mary had a submucous cleft palate. It was assumed that with such a developmental feature, the girl would never be able to speak normally. But, against all odds, she started speaking around 6 years old. Not everyone understood her right away, though over time her speech became more coherent. Only one serious obstacle remained. Mary couldn't make loud sounds like screaming. The genetic disorder also affected her vision, so the girl wore glasses and oriented herself very poorly in space. She could get lost even in her own yard. Grandmother Mia said that describing Mary is like trying to describe a work of art. There aren't enough adjectives to accurately convey how special she was. Due to the diagnosis, her mental abilities lagged behind. At 20 years old, she had the mind of a 15-year-old teenager. Despite her quirky personality, Mary was very loving, caring, and always saw only the good in everything. With strangers, she was a bit shy, but that didn't stop her from being passionate about music and fashion. The girl loved dressing up and doing photo shoots. She used her artistic abilities to create beautiful makeup and hairstyles. In school, Mary hung out with a small group of close friends. As she got older, she started dating boys. But nothing serious came of it, because the girl wasn't interested in the physical aspects of relationships. One of the guys Collins was friends with in school was Levery. They just hung out together and visited each other's homes. After they broke up, there were no hard feelings between them, and they still remained friends. After graduating high school, Mary's number of friends sharply decreased. Young people her age were going to college, building careers, moving, and starting adult lives. At that time, the girl still had the mindset of a teenager, so their interests didn't match, and her girlfriends, for the most part, began to naturally drift apart. It would seem that such a sweet and innocent girl like Mary wouldn't encounter bullying. That would be as heartless as hurting a harmless, clueless puppy. In school, her brothers and sisters protected her, fiercely shielding her from any encroachments. But in adult life, Collins unexpectedly found that for some reason, she became the target of attacks from an adult girl named Kaye Levery. Kaye was 24 years old. Out of nowhere, she started bullying Mary in every way on social media, going from rude comments under photos to sudden apologies and shows of friendly affection. It was very strange. First, to write that a girl like Mary is needed by no one, and it's better for her to disappear as soon as possible. To advise Collins to work on being less ugly and hope that a bus hits her. And then to start emotionally manipulating Mary and say that they were friends. The girls had never interacted in real life. The only social connection was that Kaye was dating and living with Levery, Mary's former boyfriend from school days. Perhaps Levery knew how charming and interesting Mary was and envied her. And when she realized that she was also vulnerable and even naive, she decided to have fun with her. Mary's family saw her on social media and the comments on the photos. They worried about her and paid attention to this strange Kaye. But when they tried to warn Mary, the girl declared that Levery was her friend. Once, Kaye wrote to Mary that she was just bored, so that's why she was attacking her. She was amusing herself out of idleness, while the other was becoming increasingly insecure because of the constant attacks. Mary realized that her slow speech, glasses, and lack of understanding of many things greatly hindered her in life. Sometimes the most dangerous people are those who seem to have everything, but they constantly remain dissatisfied and ungrateful, getting things without much effort. At some point, unlimited access to everything they want leads to seeking alternative forms of entertainment. This is very similar to the case of Kaye Levery, who received a very privileged upbringing. Her father was the chief architect of a company. The family lived in a house worth over $1 million, and the unemployed Kaye considered this her advantage. She thought that her parents' money somehow made her better than everyone else. The girl enrolled herself among geniuses, boasting about her high school education. However, her behavior showed her real level of intelligence. Once, Mary couldn't take the attacks and asked to be left alone, to which Kaye replied that her parents were millionaires, so she could treat people however she pleased. And this was said by an adult 24-year-old person. By 2020, Mary had turned 20. Her family still protected the girl very much, who longed to become independent. But the diagnosis hindered her orientation, especially in such a big city as Charlotte in North Carolina, where they lived. It was a major commercial center of the state. One of the especially trendy districts in the city was NODA, which means North Davidson. Here, the artistic scene flourished, and there was a more electric atmosphere. So many aspiring artists and musicians lived and spent time in this area. Mary couldn't work or drive a car. She had to rely on others for transportation. Her carefree nature and inability to manage money made grandmother Mia responsible for her granddaughter's finances. She controlled her expenses and gradually gave out the disability money so that she wouldn't spend it frivolously. Mary also used the family phone plan with her grandmother and grandfather. Mia had an app to track her granddaughter's phone, and the woman could always check the location to ensure Mary's safety. Over time, the girl learned to use the Uber app to call a taxi. And now, she didn't always have to depend on people for rides. The beginning of the pandemic was a time of fear and uncertainty. It was especially hard for young people accustomed to constantly hanging out with friends. The requirements to stay home were an absolute nightmare for those who couldn't spend whole days alone in confined spaces. When the initial hysteria subsided, social distancing was still a problem for sociable people. Mary was in quarantine for several weeks, and by the end of March 2020, she started slowly going crazy. On Saturday, March 28th, Collins received a message from Kaye. Levery invited her to visit the apartment in the NODA district to have a movie marathon. Mary was a bit worried because of that stormy history between them on social media, but the girl apologized for some rude words said to Collins, and she, delighted with a new girlfriend, instantly forgave her. Plus, Lavi Pham was there, whom she knew. Mary so desperately wanted to get out of the house that she was ready to run anywhere. Grandmother Mia didn't want to let her granddaughter go at all. She didn't trust Kaye after all her statements. The woman even tried to intercept the departing Mary by asking the driver not to agree to the trip. But the driver looked at the girl and said that she was already old enough to decide for herself. Collins had no idea that the night of watching movies would turn into a real nightmare. Mia checked Mary's location on her phone a little later to make sure she had safely arrived at the apartment. She wrote several messages to find out when to expect her home, but her granddaughter didn't respond. There was no activity on her social media page either. Then, one of Mary's sisters found a video on Lavi's account where Kaye and Mary were lounging around, carelessly walking around the apartment and picking up sushi delivery. There was also a moment when Kaye hugged Mary and smiled at her, as if they had been friends for many years. Mia waited and worried about her granddaughter all night because she still wasn't responding to calls or messages. The woman didn't sleep a wink. And in the morning, not receiving any news from Mary, Mia decided to go to Kaye's apartment herself to pick up her granddaughter and bring her home. She didn't want to assert her authority over the girl, but it was about her safety. Mia got to the residential complex but couldn't enter the courtyard. The way was blocked by metal gates with a code lock. The door to the building was also locked for outsiders. The woman had to wait until one of the residents came out. When she finally reached the apartment on the 3rd floor, no one opened the door for her. Mia knew Mary was there. The location of her mobile indicated that. She knocked louder and louder, then started shouting and threatening the police, and only then did Kaye open the door. Mary's grandmother was the last person she expected to see. The girl calmly stated that Collins had already left, and Mia knew she was lying. First, her granddaughter had recently broken her glasses and couldn't have left the apartment alone. Second, Mary wouldn't have left without asking her for money. And third, the app showed that the phone was still inside the apartment. The woman couldn't understand why Kaye was lying, so she asked permission to personally make sure Mary wasn't there. Mia frantically walked around the apartment, shouting her granddaughter's name. She pulled back the shower curtain, looked in the closets, but there really was no one there. The only place Kaye didn't let her into was the bedroom. The hostess stated that it was too personal a room for outsiders to walk through, and at the moment, her friends were there. Mia persisted, but Kaye simply showed her the door. The grandmother started crying and begging the girl, but she just sneered contemptuously, saying she didn't care about Collins. Then the woman started shouting Mary's name over Kaye's head, hoping that her granddaughter would hear and come out of the bedroom. However, instead, Levery came out of the room. Mia had no choice but to leave. The woman inspected the complex and other nearby places where Mary could have gotten to on her own, but she was nowhere to be seen. Then she called 911 and asked for help in searching for her granddaughter. However, law enforcement didn't take the grandmother's request seriously. One of the officers went to the specified address, but no one opened the door for him, and he just left. That was the end of the help. The family spent another night desperately worrying about Mary, with whom they had never lost contact before. On March 31st, 2020, the Mecklenburg Police Department accepted an official missing person report. Detective Jonathan Gaskin was assigned to handle the investigation, who stated that he could conduct the case remotely, and it wasn't necessary to physically go to the apartment at all. Mia was dissatisfied that he wasn't talking to anyone, so she decided to return to the apartment herself, but couldn't get there. All the relatives understood that Mary couldn't have just gone somewhere. Either she was being held against her will, or something terrible had happened in that house. The girl's mom printed flyers and hung them in all crowded places. Mia called the apartment building's office and asked the manager for the surveillance camera footage from the high-rise. He promised to look at them later. Jonathan Gaskin, the lead detective on the case, didn't want to acknowledge the urgency of the situation and stubbornly didn't understand that Mary was in danger. He knew the girl was already 20 years old, but the family was going crazy for some reason. In his opinion, at that age, a person can already take care of themselves. He didn't even want to look at the recorded video material to confirm that Mary had left the apartment. Mia saw that the police were wasting precious time, so she, along with Kaye, Mary's mom, went to Kaye's apartment again. Beforehand, she called 911 to enlist the help of law enforcement. This time, Levery opened the door. He allowed Kaye to enter and inspect the rooms, but refused to let the officer in for a search. The woman nervously looked around the apartment. She even peeked into the bedroom where someone was sleeping, covered with a blanket. Levery said it was Kaye, so Kaye continued moving. She didn't know there was another bathroom in that room. Meanwhile, the officer went to the manager, and for some reason said they no longer needed to look at the surveillance camera footage, because they didn't have a warrant. But that was stupid, because the manager himself didn't need a warrant to view it. Several days later, when the police finally decided to seize the recorded material, it was too late. All the footage from the previous period had been erased because a new month had begun. And what was most offensive The recordings were deleted just an hour before the detectives applied with a warrant. This was one of many mistakes in the investigation of this case. In light of the police's directed actions and their lack of concern about Mary's disappearance, the family had no choice but to take everything into their own hands. They felt completely abandoned by the very institution that is supposed to serve and protect them. The Mecklenburg officers turned out to be indifferent and uninterested. Unwavering love for Mary gave the family the strength and determination needed to conduct their own investigation. The thought of leaving the girl's life to fate was simply impossible. For them, her life was priceless. Collins's loved ones independently organized search parties, reached out through social media to anyone who might have any information, and distributed countless flyers throughout the city. The family took turns staking out the apartment so that Kaye and Levery couldn't take anything out unnoticed or get rid of any potential evidence. However, the police insisted on stopping these actions. Since Levery and Kaye filed a stalking complaint, they allegedly didn't feel safe when their apartment was constantly being watched. Family friends and other community members helped search for the girl in nearby areas. Relatives even hired drones, and volunteers with search dogs combed the forest, construction sites, and even rummaged through trash containers, but all this without any help from the police. Deep down, the loved ones felt that Mary had actually never left that ill-fated apartment. The family still managed to get permission to visit it and even arranged to bring in cadaver dogs trained to search for human remains. All they needed was to get the signature of the lead detective on the case, Jonathan Gaskin. But he never responded or called them back in time, and the opportunity to use the dogs was lost. In addition, an anonymous message came to the station that Collins had run away from home before. This was false information, but the department somehow accepted it as fact, without any arguments. And again, precious time was wasted. It took a whole 7 days since Mary disappeared before the Mecklenburg Police Department finally started taking the situation seriously. Grandmother Mia was completely physically and emotionally exhausted. She had protected Mary her whole life, and now had done everything in her power. The woman even resorted to sleeping in the parking lot of that apartment building where her granddaughter disappeared. Meanwhile, relatives browsing social media found photos on Levery's page with an unfamiliar guy from the days when Mary disappeared. In one of the shots, this person had a knife in his hand. After asking acquaintances, the Collins family learned that it was 22-year-old James Salerno. He was Levery's childhood friend and lived across the street from him. On April 3, 2020, officers received reliable information confirming what Mary's family had been saying all along. The girl had actually never left the apartment where Kaye and Levery lived. James Salerno told one of his buddies that he was at the party that night, and when he arrived, the couple had tied Mary up in the bathtub, beaten her to death, and hidden her body in a mattress. He said they planned to burn the mattress later. Only then did Detective Gaskin finally decide to use his authority and head to the apartment to talk to Levery and Kaye. He searched every room and noticed that everything was very dirty. The detective even ordered the owners to lift all the mattresses, but he still didn't see any signs of Mary. The next day, an informant called the police and assured them that the girl was not just under the mattress, but inside it. He also reported another girl who was at the party. It was 18-year-old Salerno's girlfriend named America Dill. James and his girlfriend were witnesses to how Kaye and Levery tied Mary up and beat her with a bottle on the head. The reason for everything was that Levery and Kaye wanted to have a threesome with Collins, but she refused. Then the hosts allegedly forced Salerno to clean up the bloody mess. His words raised doubts because James is a pretty big guy compared to Levery. Nevertheless, he said he helped the couple wrap Mary in trash bags and tape her body, after which they placed it in the mattress. Upon hearing this new information, the Mecklenburg police obtained an official search warrant for Levery and Kaye's apartment. The detectives focused on the back bedroom, where there was a bed piled with a bunch of things. Before removing the bed, they found a bloody knife in the corner of the room, and next to the bookshelf lay Colin's ID and debit card. Luminol indicated the presence of blood on the bathroom mats and shower curtain, but the sinks and walls gave the strongest reaction. A later forensic examination concluded that despite the obvious attempt to clean up, Mary's DNA was found in 6 places. After all that, the police finally proceeded to inspect the bed. If Detective Gaskin had lifted the mattress himself, he would have realized the first time that it was very heavy. The mattress was taped along the seams, and inside it they found several flattened cardboard boxes, under which lay Mary Collins' body, wrapped in trash bags. The girl was completely doused with pumpkin spice shower gel and dish soap in an attempt to mask the smell. Later, the forensic examination concluded that the fingerprints on the trash bags matched America's Salerno's girlfriend. Also inside were several t-shirts with bloodstains hidden. The mattress springs and material resembling stuffing were piled up in another room. After this discovery, things got even worse. The medical examiner faced a difficult task of figuring out exactly what happened to the girl. He started by pulling her out of 2 large black bags. The body was wrapped in tourniquets and twisted with clothing, presumably to absorb the blood seeping from the wounds. More than 133 cuts and 24 stab wounds were found. All of them were shallow enough not to be the cause of her death. Most likely, Mary was tortured. There were also signs that the girl was subjected to very brutal sexual assault due to the presence of 2 men's DNA found on her body. The DNA results were inconclusive due to attempts to erase the evidence, but it wasn't hard to figure out who they belonged to. Someone warned Mia that an ambulance was approaching the house, and this gave her temporary hope that Mary had been found alive. The woman rushed to the nearest hospital, but they told her Collins wasn't there. The grandmother hurried to another clinic, but due to pandemic restrictions, she couldn't go inside. Almost immediately, they called her on her cell phone and asked her to return home. At home, 2 officers were already waiting for her, who reported the horrific find in Kaye and Lavi's apartment. Mia couldn't even listen to all the details. She was in too much rage from grief and from realizing that her granddaughter could have been saved if the police had responded immediately to the request for help. The lead detective, Jonathan Gaskin, couldn't even meet Mary's relatives face to face, now realizing that they were right from the beginning. After everything that happened, the Mecklenburg police needed to determine how involved each person who was in the apartment that night was in Collins' death. From text messages between Lavi and Kaye, investigators learned that the girl was drugged with strong sedative drugs capable of impairing a person's coordination, lowering blood pressure, slurring speech, and even increasing libido, and often used at parties. The 3 suspects, Kaye Levery, James Salerno, and Lavi Pham, were brought in for questioning. Each of them tried to blame everything on each other and minimize their own involvement. Lavi Pham was questioned first. The detectives were shocked by his behavior. The guy stated that he saw with his own eyes how Mary left the apartment the next day, and since then, he hadn't heard anything about her. When the officers made it clear that they didn't believe his story, Lavi didn't want to answer questions and asked for a lawyer. Kaye Levery told a practically identical story, adding the fact that Mary and James didn't get along. According to her, she tried her best to help find Mary. As soon as Kaye realized that the detectives knew more than she thought, she also asked for a lawyer. James Salerno was arrested at his parents' house the night Mary was discovered. He almost completely shifted the responsibility to Kaye, Lavi, and America Dill. America, sensing something was wrong, didn't wait for arrest and drove across the country to Colorado. However, on May 7th, she personally came to the police station. She was extradited back to North Carolina. Even before the interrogation began, she enlisted the support of a lawyer. And only in October did she finally decide to answer some questions in the presence of a lawyer. According to America, she arrived at the party, got high on illegal substances, and fell asleep. Around 7 a.m., she went home. Later, James picked her up and took her back to the apartment. In the bathtub, she saw a lifeless Mary with small cuts all over her body and one deep cut. There were red stains everywhere. America got scared and wanted to leave, but the three friends threatened to do the same to her if she didn't help with the cleanup. Levery gave James some money and ordered him and America to go to the store for cleaning supplies, including bleach. When they returned, Kaye, threatening with a knife, forced her to wrap Mary's body with tape and bags. All this time, James and Levery laughed and joked about the horrible things they did to Mary. Although all the stories differed, the consistent detail was that Kaye was the instigator. She stood aside and gave orders while the other three cleaned the bathroom. After all the information became public, more and more people shared their experiences interacting with the suspects, especially Kaye Levery. They said she had been bullying Mary online for months. Evidence surfaced that Kaye targeted other girls as well, including another ex of her boyfriend, Levery. Other people who knew Kaye in the past said she was always a master of manipulation, cared only about money and status, and did absolutely everything to ruin the lives of those she considered a threat. But what threat could a 20-year-old girl with the mind of a child pose? Perhaps Kaye hated and insanely envied Mary's kindness and innocence, which she herself clearly lacked. Collins was the complete opposite of Levery. Apparently, Kaye couldn't accept that someone so pure, beautiful, and without material wealth could interest her boyfriend. All the evidence against Kaye was presented in court. Text messages, witness testimonies, and much more. Everything pointed to premeditation. Kaye and her team of lawyers realized that the only chance to ever get out was to make a deal. On June 30th, 2022, Kaye Levery pleaded guilty to second-degree felony, kidnapping and concealing a human body. She was sentenced to just 32 years with the possibility of parole after 25 years. This deal with Kaye was another slap in the face for Mary's family. Levery made a statement addressed to friends from the Collins family, saying she would pray that their souls wouldn't harden after the death of a loved one, and that a higher power would help ease their suffering. For Kaye, who has a real tattoo of a burning church on her body, to utter a prayer for Mary and her family. It sounded very offensive. The prosecution was initially ready to make a deal with Levery as well, but after Kaye's sentencing, they excluded that possibility. Due to the pandemic, all court proceedings slowed down greatly. Fam is still awaiting trial, which currently has no exact date, since the Mecklenburg court system is still far behind after the pandemic. A lot of unresolved cases have accumulated there. Years may pass before Mary's case is finally completed. That wouldn't be so bad if all the defendants were awaiting trial behind bars. However, the Collins family was dealt another blow. Both James Salerno and America Dill are currently out on bail. Their defense team did everything possible so they wouldn't suffer in prison. Defendants are considered innocent until proven guilty. It's unclear why the comfort and needs of potential criminals are placed above the offended feelings of the victim's family. After all, it's obvious that such serious cases should have some priority in consideration. The system failed Mary's family at the moment she disappeared, and the least they could do now is not allow the people who stole her life to just live their normal lives as if nothing happened. The girl, who overcame so many of her speech problems, still didn't have the ability to scream. She couldn't cry out loudly for help when a group of monsters tortured and abused her. Mary worked hard to find her voice. That's why her family created an organization and named it Mary's Voice to achieve justice for the person who meant so much to them. Mary Collins' loved ones want people to know what happened to her. Society must be sure that nothing like this will ever happen again, and Mary's voice will finally be heard. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. In the teenage period, children go through a difficult time for moms and dads. Hormone surge, search for one's place in life, separation from parents, and first serious independent decisions. But the worst is adolescent infatuation, when there is still a lack of experience and knowledge, when the object of adoration seems ideal, And it's good if parents can find the time and strength to explain to the child that first love very rarely becomes the last. The story of Susan Bailey is one of the most horrifying and cruel real criminal stories where there is everything: a strange love triangle, split personality, reincarnation, and even death. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. In 2008, Susan Bailey lived in Roanoke, Texas. She was 43 years old. She was a very happy woman, and although the town with a population of 11,000 people was not the limit of her dreams, it was exactly the place where Susan needed to be at that moment in her life. The thing is, Bailey was a single mother with 2 children. Her house was on a street where many similar families lived. It was a wonderful neighborhood. Right across the road from the house was a huge park, and when the children were little, they ran there to play. So Roanoke was practically an ideal place for raising kids. For the safety of her son and daughter, Susan, like any mother, was ready to give up fulfilling her own dream. Susan herself also grew up in a small, quiet town, not far from St. Paul, Minnesota, where everyone knew each other. Once in the mid-'80s, when the girl was about 20 years old, a terrible snowstorm hit Minnesota. Snow literally buried the entire state. People couldn't get to work normally. Cars simply couldn't cope with the snowdrifts on the roads. It was after this storm that Susan told her parents that she was tired of living in snow, ice, and cold. She'd had enough. Even before the start of the next winter, the girl decided to move to a warm place and settle her personal life there. She went to Riverside, California, a city located east of Los Angeles. Although Susan was born and raised in the Midwest, she quickly realized that in her soul, she was a California girl. She liked the warm weather that was there year-round, and she was glad that she finally had her own housing, where she could manage as the owner. However, that wasn't the main thing she liked about California. Susan met a guy named Richard Bailey and fell in love. Richard was born and raised in California. He was a short, dark-haired young man. He exuded some kind of California vibe. He lived by his own principles, not fixating on generally accepted norms. Susan and Richard dated until they realized they were made for each other. In the spring of 1988, they got married. The bride's parents immediately didn't like her daughter's chosen one. They were sure it was a hasty decision and that Susan could find someone better for herself. The girl's mother and father considered the guy rude and said that Richard didn't show them proper respect when meeting. However, there was another problem. The thing is, Richard served in the Air Force, and military personnel constantly received new orders. They had to move from place to place often. The newlyweds were in love with each other, and difficulties didn't scare them. After several months of forced moves around the country, Richard retired and worked for some time in the Coast Guard. In 1990, the couple had a baby girl, Jennifer, and 5 years later, a second child was born, son David. Jennifer studied very well at school. She spent all her free time reading books and drawing. The girl never got into any trouble. This was a child you didn't have to worry about particularly, because Jennifer knew how to make the right decisions from childhood. She had wonderful relationships with her parents, but with her peers, Jennifer didn't make friends. She wasn't bullied at school, she was just a loner by nature. She preferred spending time at home rather than seeking some popularity among classmates. In high school, Jennifer never went on dates or to parties like most girls. At that time, it interested her little. David admired his older sister and wanted to be like her in everything. He also loved to draw and read a lot. The boy went to the library every day to pick out another book. By 2006, the Bailey family had settled in Roanoke, Texas. Susan and Richard had been married for 18 years already. But lately, the relationship between the spouses wasn't working out. Richard quit the Coast Guard and hadn't worked anywhere since 1990. He sat at home all day while his wife worked to support the family. In the end, the woman got tired of such a life and the situation in the house became very tense. As a result, by the end of 2006, the Bailey spouses divorced. Susan retained custody of the children, and Richard agreed to pay alimony. At that time, the woman worked in retail and didn't earn much. Even taking alimony into account, she had to work 2 jobs practically without days off to make ends meet. At that time, David was 13 years old, and Jennifer was 17. Surely at that age, children should have understood that money doesn't fall from the sky, that it needs to be earned. But for some reason, they resented their mom because she was constantly not at home, because Susan didn't spend time with them like before. They considered it unfair that their family couldn't afford to buy some fashionable things, modern gadgets, and other material stuff. However, the reason Susan was often absent was that she wanted to provide a decent life for her children. The woman didn't go to parties, didn't hang out in bars, and didn't meet with girlfriends. She earned money, albeit small, but apparently, due to their age, the children behaved selfishly towards their mother. Jennifer and David knew that their family needed to calculate funds economically to stick to the budget. They didn't starve and didn't walk in rags, but they understood that in their case, spending money on unnecessary entertainment was inadvisable. They had a family tariff plan for cellular service. At that time, companies set limits on internet traffic and the number of used minutes. There were limits, exceeding which resulted in huge amounts. Each additional minute or additional gigabyte of internet cost very dearly. Nevertheless, as if in revenge on their mother, Jennifer began calling and texting practically everyone she knew. And David spent much more time online than the tariff plan allowed. The children spent so much that the bill for 1 month amounted to $1,500. It was a fairly large sum, and for a mother who worked 2 jobs to feed her children, the sum was practically unaffordable. Despite this, the children made no efforts to reduce expenses. They simply ignored adult problems. The situation worsened when Jennifer started dating a guy named Paul Hansen from her school. Paul was a year younger. She was 17 and he was 16. The young man lived outside the city in a trailer, so they rode bikes to visit each other. What united the young people was that their parents were divorced, and one of them practically didn't participate in the children's lives. Jennifer no longer saw her father, and Paul had little contact with his mom. He was raised by his father, Paul Hansen Sr. It so happened that Susan didn't like Jennifer's guy at all. She considered Paul strange and couldn't explain the reasons. The young man differed too much from his peers. Moreover, the daughter seemed to take her relationship with her boyfriend too seriously. This was the worst nightmare of any parent, and it became reality for Susan Bailey. Jennifer was studying in the senior class of high school and planned to enter an art college in Dallas. After meeting Paul, her behavior and academic performance noticeably deteriorated. The girl should have focused on what she would do after graduating from school, but infatuation clouded her mind. The mother tried to talk to her daughter about her relationship with Paul, but it had no success. However, Susan herself in her youth did exactly the same, marrying against her parents' will. And now history was repeating itself. The more she let Jennifer know that she didn't approve of her choice, the stronger the daughter became attached to Paul. It was some kind of vicious circle. Whatever Paul did, nothing could make Jennifer break up with him. Around the same time when the young people started dating, Paul got very close to a 14-year-old schoolgirl named Marilee. This was a fictitious name. For confidentiality purposes, the girl's real name was not disclosed in the media, but all reporters called her exactly that. Marilee was crazy about Paul, literally idolized him. He seemed mysterious, unusual, even a bit scary to her. They spent a lot of time together, and in the end, Paul suggested Marilee date. Although the schoolgirl knew that Hansen already had a girlfriend, she couldn't refuse a relationship with the guy she was in love with. Marilee was thrilled with Paul's proposal, and naturally agreed. The wildest thing is that these two didn't hide, conceal, or meet secretly from Jennifer. They directly told her about their plans. Paul stated that he had dissociative identity disorder, simply put, split personality. One of his personalities wants to date Jennifer, and the other with Marilee. He called his second personality, in love with Marilee, Talos. According to the guy, since the personalities were independent of each other, he shouldn't be blamed for cheating on one of the girls. In reality, dissociative identity disorder is characterized by the inability to recall everyday life events, important personal information, traumatic or stressful events. Patients suffering from this disease may experience sudden intrusive disturbances in speech, affective spheres of behavior. But Paul didn't actually behave like a young man suffering from this ailment. He acted more like a very cunning and calculating person. Most likely he had some mental health problems, but he made up this diagnosis for himself. Only Jennifer and Marilee didn't know about it. In the end, both girls started dating Paul simultaneously. From that moment, everything became even stranger. Paul Hansen told crazy stories about his other personality. According to him, Talos wasn't some other person created by his subconscious. Paul believed that Talos was a real existing man who lived in the 1700s, that he was an executioner, a real historical figure whose soul somehow ended up trapped in the body of a 16-year-old teenager from Texas. Paul also believed in reincarnation, the concept according to which the soul after death doesn't disappear but incarnates in a new physical body. And the guy would like to spend all his lives next to Jennifer and Marilee. He told both girls that if they spend all their time together and don't let anyone come between them, then they could reincarnate together and spend their next life together too. Both infatuated schoolgirls gladly agreed to reincarnate and eternally stay next to Paul and Talos. Now Jennifer and Marilee were not rivals. They became best friends and lovers, since they made love as a threesome with Paul. Sometimes the young man himself got confused in his personalities and showed feelings for Jennifer as Talos, or vice versa. Acting as Paul, he courted Marilee. In general, it was a complex and tangled knot of strange relationships. Jennifer's mom, Susan, didn't know even half of what was happening in her daughter's pair with Paul, but subconsciously felt that it was abnormal and that Hansen brought only trouble. As soon as Jennifer realized that Susan was against her beloved, she started running away from home to the trailer where her boyfriend lived with his father and stepmother. Paul Sr. didn't like that his son's girlfriends were constantly hanging around in his house. The man more than once offered to drive Jennifer home. She pretended to leave, but then still sneaked back to Paul. Sometimes the young man himself came to Jennifer's home and stayed there while Susan was at work. At some point, Jennifer, Marilee, and Paul got tired of hiding. The teenagers no longer wanted their father or mother to tell them what to do and how to live. The situation escalated so much that the trio decided to send their parents to the other world, take all their money, and flee to Canada to start a new happy life. The biggest problem was Susan, because she was the one who forbade Jennifer to see Paul the most and interfered with their relationship in every way. All three saw this woman as an enemy. Marilee was very close to her mom, but she also didn't approve of her daughter's friendship with Paul, for the same reasons as Susan Bailey. The woman also considered the guy strange, although Marilee loved her mother, but if she had to choose between her and the two lovers, the girl would unhesitatingly choose Jennifer and Paul. She was ready for anything just to be with them. As for Paul Sr., he really liked Jennifer. The father knew that his son had mental health problems, but after communicating with the girl, the guy looked calmer. However, the father got tired of seeing the lovers constantly meeting secretly, because of which Susan, Jennifer's mother, constantly called him and asked where her daughter was. Paul Sr. knew about Marilee too. He didn't approve of this unusual union, but didn't declare it openly. Nevertheless, the man also fell under the distribution. He was supposed to die, like the girls' mothers, only because he didn't support his son's choice. So, the three teenagers planned to commit a crime, taking the lives of their closest people. To implement the plan, they decided to involve another person, someone who immensely admired Jennifer, her younger brother David, who was 13 years old at the time. The guy had just entered the teenage period, and parental authority had greatly shaken in his eyes, especially after his older sister complained that their mother forbade her to see her loved one. David and Susan constantly quarreled over any reason anyway, so the teenager easily agreed to participate in his sister's insidious plan. The four young people, Jennifer, Paul, Marilee, and David, decided that Susan should die first. The main question was how they would take her life. One of the ideas that came to them from the beginning was to send her to the other world using electric current. The teenagers stripped one end of the wire and hung it so that it dangled over the bathtub. When Susan went to take a shower, she would receive a fatal electric shock. After the woman's death, they would hide the electric cord from the police, and then everything would look like an accident. Jennifer, Paul, Marilee, and David believed that rescuers would see Susan dead in the shower, not notice the stripped wire, and take it for a heart attack. Apparently, the teenagers were unaware that usually a pathologist performs an autopsy and determines the exact cause of death. In addition to this plan, they had another backup in case the first one didn't work. It was much more cruel because the young people decided to simply beat Susan to death, or at least beat her to unconsciousness, and then put her in the bathtub and apply the original plan of execution by electric current. At the same time, for some reason, they thought that no one would pay attention to bruises, cuts, broken bones, or other signs of beating. The teenagers clearly weren't distinguished by intelligence, because they sacredly believed that their plan would work. However, something made them come up with a third plan, because in the end, they tried to take Susan's life in another way. The woman had a sweet tooth and adored chocolate pudding. The daughter knew perfectly well about her mother's habits. One evening, Jennifer prepared a large pot of pudding and crushed a whole bunch of pills into it. She hoped that her mom would eat the dessert and have an overdose. But Susan tried a piece, spit it out, and said that the dish didn't turn out, and then, at Jennifer's request, put it in the refrigerator. September 19th, 2008, arrived. It was Friday, and Marilee went to visit Jennifer. She didn't even bother to warn her mom about it. In the end, the woman decided that her daughter had run away from home. Strangely, she didn't report it to the police, hoping to find Marilee herself. Apparently, for the girl, leaving home without any permission had become a habit. All weekend, the mother drove around the city streets and looked for her disobedient daughter. At that time, Susan, as usual, was busy with work and didn't even notice that Jennifer was not alone in the room. Finally, on Monday, Marilee's mom met her daughter wandering the street not far from her friend's house. The woman put the girl in the car and asked her to explain what was happening and where she had been. The schoolgirl looked very upset. Being next to her mom, she couldn't hold back and burst into tears, and then started telling her about how she wanted to reincarnate and be with Paul in another life. Essentially, Marilee confessed to the existence of a terrible plan that needed to be implemented for their future. However, her mom found it strange. The woman didn't take her daughter's words seriously, because to her it sounded like complete nonsense about past incarnations. Reincarnations and spirits of an executioner from the 1700s. But Marilee was very depressed and didn't stop crying all evening. Even lying in her bed, she sobbed so that her mother heard her through the wall. On Tuesday, September 23rd, Marilee's mom woke up not because the alarm rang, but because her bed was shaking. The woman opened her eyes and saw her daughter standing over her with a butcher knife in her hand, like some villain from a horror movie. Fortunately, the mother managed to crawl to the other side of the bed, grab her mobile phone, and dial the emergency service number. The woman shouted at Marilee to put the knife down immediately, but the girl, through tears, stated that she would take the car and leave. Marilee repeated the same words, "I have to go with them. I have to go with them. We all were supposed to leave, and you ruined everything." Then, apparently, some struggle ensued between the mother and daughter. The operator on the line heard all this and sent a patrol car to the house. A few seconds later, Marilee's mom said into the phone that she managed to take the knife away, and now she was safe. The police who arrived at the scene immediately arrested Marilee and charged her with aggravated assault. During the interrogation, the girl didn't say anything specific, but only kept repeating that she needed a car to go to Canada. Unfortunately, the detectives didn't inquire about what Marilee's final plan consisted of. The girl's mom was alive, so they limited themselves to standard questions. The police knew that the schoolgirl had attacked her mother, but didn't suspect that someone else was involved in this plan. They considered it an ordinary teenage tantrum and didn't attach special importance. The attempt to deal with Marilee's mother failed. Next in line was Paul. The guy stole his father's gun and sat in the trailer, waiting for Paul Sr. and his stepmother to return from work. He planned to shoot them as soon as they crossed the threshold of the house. But then fate itself intervened. Paul didn't know that on that very day, his parents made a spontaneous decision to go on a romantic date. Instead of going home after work, they met at a restaurant and had dinner, and then together went to the cinema to watch a movie. As a result, Paul's father and stepmother were delayed for several hours. At some point, the guy got tired of sitting in the trailer and waiting. He got bored, and he simply put away the gun and completely abandoned his plan of reprisal. Paul's parents had no idea that their lives were in danger. On the same day, September 23rd, when Marilee tried to stab her mother, David, Jennifer's brother, brought a knife to school. He didn't try to harm anyone, but he boasted about the weapon to his friends. When the information about the knife reached the teacher, David was suspended from classes for 3 days for bringing a weapon to school. Perhaps this teacher's decision saved someone's life. In the evening of the same day, a report of Paul's disappearance came to the police. In fact, the father was used to his teenage son sneaking out of the house and disappearing for several days. But this time, the man was worried because the gun had disappeared from the safe, and Paul Sr. suspected that it was his son who took it without permission. It didn't take the police much time to track down the runaway. He turned out to be at his girlfriend Jennifer Bailey's house. However, the guy managed to escape, and Susan didn't even know that her daughter's boyfriend was hiding in their house. Therefore, she was in shock when the police early in the morning asked for permission to search their house. As a result, a rather tense conversation took place between Susan and Jennifer. The mother yelled at her daughter and said that she would immediately send her to California to her grandparents or to Minnesota to live with her father. While Susan was scolding Jennifer, the police searched the house. They found several suitcases with things, among which was a bag containing several kitchen knives. Then the officers checked the schoolgirl's mobile phone and listened to several voice messages from Marilee's mom, who called to find out what was happening with her daughter. But Jennifer never called her back. The puzzle in Susan's head began to come together. She had just learned from the voice messages that Marilee had attacked her mother with a knife. And before that, the police found a bag stuffed with cold weapons. Her children were behaving strangely. Susan put one and one together and suddenly realized that the chocolate pudding prepared by Jennifer the day before was poisoned. That's why it had such a chemical aftertaste. Learning about the knives and everything else, it dawned on the mother that her own daughter wanted to take her life in such a cunning way. The woman complained to the patrol officers that perhaps they wanted to poison her. The officers investigating the case of Paul Hansen's disappearance didn't take Susan's words seriously and, not finding the teenager in her house, simply left. 2 days later, on September 26th, Susan Bailey didn't show up for her shift at the store. And this was completely unlike her. She never missed work and didn't take sick leave. The manager tried to contact her, but the woman didn't pick up the phone. Then colleagues called her mother Kate, whom Susan had listed as the contact person in case of emergency. Kate, who lived in Minnesota, in turn tried to call her grandchildren. They surely knew what could have happened to Susan, but neither Jennifer nor David answered, and the landline phone in the house kept ringing and ringing. Kate had a bad premonition, so she dialed the police number and asked to check if everything was okay with her daughter. When the patrol officers arrived at Susan's house, They didn't notice anything suspicious, no signs of break-in. The door was locked. The light was still on the porch. The officers knocked on the door, walked around the house, and decided that perhaps the mother and children had gone out of town since Susan's car wasn't in the driveway. Perhaps the woman simply forgot to warn her relatives about it. Later, the police called Kate back and explained that nothing terrible had happened, but the woman didn't believe them. She knew that Susan would never miss a work shift. In the end, Kate spent the rest of the day calling all her daughter's relatives, acquaintances, and friends, hoping that someone had seen her. When by the next morning she still hadn't received an answer, she again asked the police to check Susan's house. Everything repeated again. The law enforcement officers inspected the house from the outside, knocked on the door, and receiving no answer, left. By the end of September 29, 2008, the authorities received information that they couldn't ignore. The information came from the South Dakota police, but more on that later. When finally the police broke down the door and entered the Bailey house, the first thing they noticed was the smell. The house smelled of death and bleach. It was a mixture of a decomposing body and cleaning agents, as if someone had died, and then someone else tried to clean up after them. The walls, floor, furniture, everything around was splattered with blood. One of the officers called this place a slaughterhouse. The stripped electrical wire mentioned earlier dangled over the bathtub, but there was no body in the bathtub. Apparently, something didn't go according to plan. Instead of a body in the water, there was a knife and mobile phones. Apparently, someone tried to spoil the gadgets this way to destroy all the data on them. Experts checked the stripped electrical cord and concluded that due to low voltage, it couldn't have caused anyone's death. The biggest electric shock could cause pain or discomfort. Besides this, weapons were scattered everywhere in the house. In one room lay a wooden bat with blood traces. In another, knives were lying around. One was even stuck between the couch cushions. In the refrigerator, the poisoned pudding was still there, and in the attic, the pistol that Paul Hansen stole from his father was found. Among other evidence, the police found several strands of hair and scissors. Finally, the detectives went upstairs and in the corridor stumbled upon the body of 43-year-old Susan. Her throat was slit and she had 26 stab wounds. On the victim's face, traces of a baseball bat blow were visible. She was dead, judging by the degree of decomposition, for a long time already. Several days had passed since her death. During this time, blood had soaked all her clothes so much that it turned black. The carpet on which the body lay was also soaked with blood. In addition, the one who took the woman's life poured some chemical on her body. It was noticeable that the perpetrators tried to clean up the traces of their crime, but unsuccessfully because fingerprints were everywhere, as was the scattered weapon. Figuring out who did it turned out not to be so difficult. The strong smell of cleaning agents helped the investigators figure out what happened. In the trash bin, they found a receipt from Walmart. The supermarket's surveillance cameras captured how 13-year-old David Bailey came there on a bicycle several times in recent days and bought a bunch of household chemicals. The strands of hair belonged to 16-year-old Paul Hansen. Probably, the guy cut his hair to make it harder to recognize him. Essentially, the police had already solved this crime, but now they needed to gather enough evidence to press charges, find the suspects, take the case to court, and achieve a guilty verdict. The most incredible thing is that by that time, the criminals were already in custody. So, the police returned to Susan Bailey's house for the third time because they received a tip that they couldn't ignore. Law enforcement officers from another state arrested 3 young people. David, Jennifer, and Paul, with the small amount of money they stole from Susan after her death, managed to get to South Dakota, driving more than 1,000 kilometers north from Roanoke. When they got there, they had no money left even to refuel the car, and the teenagers tried to steal gasoline, but they were caught and turned over to the police. Jennifer, Paul, and David decided to commit a robbery at night in a city where there was a curfew for children under 18, and they were all minors. The patrol officers checked the car license plate and learned that the car was registered in Texas, and none of the teenagers had a driver's license. So they called the police department in Roanoke and asked to check Susan Bailey, the owner of the car. Only after this information did the officers decide to enter the house and find out where the woman had gone. In Susan's residence, the investigators also found a school pass in Marilee's name. At that time, the girl was in a juvenile detention center on charges of aggravated assault. The detectives considered it a strange coincidence that the schoolgirl tried to stab her mom with a knife, and her things ended up in the house where another crime occurred. Marilee was called in for questioning, and she confessed to everything. The high school student told about her unconventional relationships with Paul and Jennifer, reported the plan to escape to Canada, where her 3 friends were heading when they were stopped in South Dakota. Marilee was very frank, so the authorities charged her only with assault on her mother, and not with participation or planning the reprisal against Susan Bailey. The schoolgirl received immunity in exchange for cooperation with the police, so for the committed crime, Marilee spent only 5 years on probation. 13-year-old David Bailey pleaded guilty to a serious crime, and since he was a minor, he was sentenced to only 26 years in prison. He will be about 40 when he is released in 2034. 16-year-old Paul Hansen agreed to a plea deal under which he received 60 years in prison. In 30 years, he can apply for parole. The maximum sentence for a minor who committed a serious crime in Texas is life imprisonment without the right to parole. Therefore, by taking the plea deal, Paul got off easy. After the final sentence was pronounced, Paul was given a chance to tell about the crime in all details. Now he had no reason to lie. Hansen began his story with split personality, but the officer immediately interrupted him, stating that this trick wouldn't work with him. So for the rest of the conversation, Paul behaved normally and didn't even try to pretend to be someone else. This clearly indicated that the guy invented the second personality only to deceive the girls in love with him. According to Hansen, from the very beginning, it was all Jennifer's idea, that it was she who wanted her mother's death. In the evening, when Susan returned home from work, Jennifer, under a fictitious pretext, asked her mom to go up to the second floor, where Paul and David were already waiting for her. Armed with knives, the young man and the girl took turns striking until Susan died. Jennifer Bailey also agreed to a plea deal, but she was required not only to confess to the crime, but also to tell about the motives. At the sentencing hearing on October 15, 2009, the girl didn't want to explain anything, since according to her, she hadn't committed anything illegal. She tried to prove that Paul and David were to blame for everything. Allegedly, she participated in drawing up the criminal plan but didn't take it seriously and didn't believe to the end that they would actually attack their parents. Jennifer shifted all the blame to her younger brother, saying that it was David who stabbed Susan. At first, the girl was too shocked and couldn't do anything. Then, when she tried to call 911, her boyfriend Paul didn't let her call an ambulance, taking the phone. Fortunately, the judge didn't believe the schoolgirl. She was explained that the mitigation of the sentence under the plea agreement largely depends on her frankness. Jennifer took a few days to think, and at the next hearing explained everything. This time, her story fully matched the physical evidence found at the crime scene. So, Paul Hansen lived in his girlfriend's house for several days, and Susan didn't know about it. While the woman was at work, the teenagers disconnected all the landline phones in the rooms so that the mother couldn't call the rescue service. Susan's work shift ended almost around midnight. David and Paul had dozed off by then. When the mother returned home, the girl woke up her boyfriend Paul, who finished off Susan. Jennifer still claimed that she was not involved in either the stab wounds or the beatings. She didn't do anything that could harm her mother. In the end, the examination established that nevertheless, each of the 3 teenagers inflicted blows on the poor woman's body. Despite the fact that Jennifer never told the truth, the judge left her plea deal in force. As a result, she received the same sentence as her boyfriend Paul Hansen. 60 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. All three, Paul, Jennifer, and David, are still in custody. The reprisal against Susan Bailey is tragic in many ways. The mother cared for her children and loved them. She dedicated her entire life to them. And the fact that they not only took her life but did it with particular cruelty speaks to the fact that they embodied the most real evil in themselves. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. A person has three enemies. The world, consisting of people who often use freedom for evil. The devil, who sometimes comes with faith, and one's own flesh, which out of boredom and excessive freedom tends to cause harm and damage to oneself or others. Only the person has the choice, to let enemies get close or to keep them under special control. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Early in the morning on June 20th, 1996, at 2 a.m., an ambulance crew was driving down the exit from Interstate 476. Local residents called this road the Blue Route. The exit led to Marple, a small town in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. As they turned, something caught their attention. A lone blue Honda Civic with the driver's door wide open stood on the roadside. It was a bit strange, so the medics stopped to check if the driver needed help. When they approached the scene, the situation started to look even stranger. The car's engine was still running, the radio was blaring, the headlights and interior lights were on, but the driver was nowhere to be found. When the medics cautiously approached the car, they immediately realized something was wrong, and when they saw a pool of blood on the ground in front of the car, they grabbed the radio and reported the incident to the police. A few minutes later, police cars and investigators arrived at the scene, and their flashlights cut through the darkness as they tried to figure out what had happened. It was difficult to work, but the detectives quickly found a possible weapon, a stone with blood splatters and a crowbar lying next to a bloody trail leading from the car. Then the officers noticed even more crimson stains smeared on the guardrail to the right of the highway. Given that the blood was near the front of the car, the most likely scenario was a hit and run. Perhaps the driver hit someone and then, in a panic, decided to get rid of the victim and flee. The scarlet trail on the ground indicated that someone had been dragged there. However, there were no damages on the front of the Honda, so the accident version immediately seemed implausible. In the car's interior, the police found several items. On the passenger seat lay a cap, a backpack, and a jacket. On the floor, a steering wheel lock. On the back seat, the detectives found a folder with papers. During further inspection of the scene near this abandoned Honda, tire tracks from another car were noticed on the ground. Rain was starting, so the investigators had to act quickly. They tried to photograph as many potential pieces of evidence as possible before the water washed away some clues. The experts also took the opportunity to make plaster casts of the tire tracks to preserve them for further detailed analysis. While the detectives checked the license plate to find out who the car was registered to, a full-scale search was organized. Police patrolled the area, and volunteers combed through the bushes and marshy terrain near the exit. The weather worsened. Volunteers walked side by side, in some places knee-deep in water, just to find any leads that could lead to the missing driver's location. Ultimately, the search led to a pair of white sneakers and underwear found about 800 meters from where the car was discovered. No one knew if these items had any connection to the abandoned car, especially since the items were completely dry, not soiled with mud or dust, even though it had rained outside. In any case, they were bagged and sent to the forensic lab. By that time, the investigators had already established the name of the blue Honda Civic's owner. It turned out to be a 44-year-old woman named Amy Willard, who lived in a bungalow just 15 minutes' drive from the highway. Officers tried to contact her but got no response, so they assumed that this woman was behind the wheel that night. The authorities immediately issued an alert for Gail Willard with her description and photo. Usually, such alerts are passed between police departments and law enforcement dispatchers. But the authorities didn't know that Gail worked as a nurse in the emergency department, and many of her friends and colleagues kept in touch with dispatchers to track accidents and be ready to receive seriously ill patients. When Gail's name came over the radio that morning, her colleagues were shocked. They knew that a week ago, the woman had gone to her beach house in New Jersey, located about an hour-and-a-half drive away. One of the employees called Gail and told her that her car had been found abandoned on the side of the Blue Route. This news alarmed Willard because she had left the Honda with her 22-year-old daughter, Amy. The girl was supposed to come to her mom at the beach house that day. Without wasting time, Gail contacted the police and explained the situation. She gave a full description of her daughter. Height 170 centimeters, weight 55 kilograms, dark chestnut hair, blue eyes, tanned skin with freckles. Amy had an athletic build, and she had a small tattoo on her ankle in the form of the Nike logo. Then Gail called Amy's father, Paul, who was a police sergeant in a neighboring police department, and together they started contacting their daughter's friends, trying to find out where she had disappeared to. The mother couldn't calmly enjoy her vacation when her child was in trouble, so she hurried back to Pennsylvania. Gail spent the rest of the day at the spot where the Honda was found. She carefully inspected the car, hoping to find some clue that the police hadn't noticed. The woman immediately spotted an obvious scratch on the car's rear bumper and explained to the detectives that it hadn't been there before. Therefore, someone had hit the car from behind. Gail provided the police with information about the plans for that very night. It turned out that the girl had come to town for summer vacation. She was studying at George Mason University in Virginia and had achieved outstanding athletic success there. Usually, the daughter spent evenings at home with her family. But on June 19, 1996, Amy arranged to meet with former classmates at Smokey Joe's bar, which was about 30 minutes' drive from their home. The girl decided to go only because the lacrosse game was canceled due to rain. Smokey Joe's bar was a favorite hangout spot for college students year-round, but in the summer, everything changed. On weekdays, the atmosphere of the place was quiet and cozy. You could sit and chat peacefully with former classmates. The detectives found out the names and phone numbers of all Amy's friends she was with that evening, and also talked to the staff of the establishment. Everything was as usual: fun, a couple of cocktails, and sharing impressions about college studies. The next day, Amy needed to prepare for an economics class, so she left the bar earlier than her former classmates. The news of the student's disappearance quickly spread throughout the town and surrounding areas. The broadcast of the investigation in the mass media brought a flood of tips from people wanting to provide whatever help they could in searching for the girl who disappeared on the highway. Amy Eileen Willard was born on June 8, 1974, in Chester, Pennsylvania. She was the third child in the family, the youngest. Amy's father, Paul, served in the local police station. He was a serious man who believed in the power of discipline. From early childhood, he hammered one lesson into his children's heads: be attentive and careful. Learn to defend yourself. For Paul, these were not just words. Due to his job, he knew how cruel the world around could be. Amy's mother, Gail, worked as a nurse in the emergency department and saw how fragile human life is. Looking at the relatives of patients praying for the recovery of their loved ones, her greatest fear was to be in their place. From the outside, the Willards seemed like a typical friendly family, but behind closed doors, the relationships were complicated. After the parents' divorce, Amy moved to live in a small bungalow with her mom. Gail combined her maternal duties with a tight work schedule in the emergency department. Faith in God was the foundation of the entire family's life, and later, it was woven directly into Amy's daily life. Gail's sister was a nun, and the girl went to study behind the iron gates of a private Catholic school for girls, where her aunt taught. Sports were an integral part of the education. Every year, the academy produced champions in basketball, soccer, and lacrosse, and Amy quickly mastered all three games. The girl was predicted a brilliant future in sports and considered her a rising star. Enrolling at George Mason University in Virginia, where Willard studied physical education to become a high school coach, she fully lived up to her title as a local sports legend. In every match, she won, setting records for points that lasted for years. Amy was one of the 25 best female players in the country, and her goal was to achieve even greater success. In her college years, the girl not only set records in sports, but also managed to build a personal life. She started dating a guy named Al, and lately they were inseparable. Amy even introduced Al to her friends and family, and everyone around saw how deeply the young people were in love with each other. No one could imagine that Amy's triumph, her victories in championships, and her unstoppable enthusiasm would be overshadowed by cancer. The school year ended, and Amy Willard returned home to immerse herself in the familiar atmosphere of her childhood. But it wasn't a time for rest, because the student wasn't going to slow down and enrolled in courses at Delaware County Community College to keep her academic edge, even in the summer. She combined additional studies with her athletic commitments, and it wasn't easy. However, Amy succeeded. In addition to sports competitions and studies, the girl spent a lot of time looking for work, trying to fit as many things as possible into her summer vacation before returning to her final year at university. Despite all her commitments, she managed to free up time for her friends, ending up at Smokey Joe's bar on Wednesday evening, June 19th. But now she was missing, and barely glancing at the items, the sneakers, and underwear, Gail immediately realized they belonged to her daughter. This was a bad sign. The police department appealed to the public asking for any information about Amy, and a 23-year-old man named Andrew Kobach responded to their call. Andrew said that around 1 a.m., he was driving his Ford on the Blue Route and saw an abandoned car on the roadside. The police were immediately interested in why the man hadn't called 911. They also wanted to understand what brought him to that place at such a late hour, considering he worked until midnight at a nearby bar, not far from Smokey Joe's. At least, that's what he said. The detectives studied information about Andrew Kobach and learned that the young man lived in a prestigious area and had a reputation as a spoiled guy from a wealthy family who loved getting into trouble, mostly related to traffic violations. His father was a wealthy stockbroker. Of course, this didn't mean that Kobach had any connection to Amy's abduction. The investigators documented Andrew's tip and continued the search. Less than a day after Amy's disappearance, several children were playing hide-and-seek on a vacant lot when they stumbled upon a horrifying discovery. One boy saw something on the ground, not far from the trees, where the bushes approached the rocky slope of the railroad tracks. The child came closer and saw a naked female body lying face down in a fetal position. 2 plastic bags were placed over the victim's head. The frightened children ran for help from adults, and soon officers from the Philadelphia Police Department arrived at the scene. They immediately concluded that the girl's death was violent. The deceased was identified by the small Nike logo tattoo on her ankle. In this horrific way, the parents had to learn that their daughter would never return home. Amy's mom said that although this news broke her heart, now she felt relief because the hardest part was not knowing where her child was. Even if finding the criminal wouldn't bring Amy back to life, the parents could at least find out what happened to her. The autopsy showed that Amy's cause of death was head trauma from a blunt object. At least 3 blows were inflicted, which disfigured the student's face and fractured her skull in 2 places. The left eye socket, nose, and right temporal bone were broken. One of the blows caused a stroke. The blow was so forceful that due to severe blood loss, the body began to fail. Amy's heart chambers were found almost empty during the autopsy, drained of blood. There were also strange cross-shaped marks on the body, It was a thermal burn obtained in an unknown way. As a result of the brutal and rapid attack, the girl's body was injured in several places. Bruises on the thighs and defensive wounds on Amy's hands as she tried to fight off the attacker indicated that the student had been assaulted. The pathologist managed to collect samples of the perpetrator's semen, and this could serve as a good lead in the case. The most disgusting thing, to humiliate her completely, the perpetrator shoved a tree branch into Willard's genitals, which was later found inside. There was no blood at the vacant lot where Amy was found. Therefore, she was killed elsewhere, and then the body was simply disposed of. Most likely, the first attack occurred right on the roadside, in front of the car, because blood traces remained there. The girl was stunned and then taken away from the crime scene in another vehicle. After that, another attack was committed. And finally, the third place was where the children found the lifeless body. However, there was a fourth place, where the clothing items were left. Whether this was done accidentally or intentionally remained to be figured out by the investigators. The forensic lab determined that the blood found at the scene on the highway where the Honda was abandoned belonged to Amy Willard. From the tire prints, experts were able to determine the model of the car that the perpetrator presumably drove, since a similar tread was found on tires of a specific brand. By comparing all the facts, the detectives began to gradually clarify the picture of what happened. Leaving the bar, Amy got into her car and drove along the blue route of Interstate 476 toward her mother's house. Exiting the road for some reason, she pulled over to the shoulder and got out of the car, or she was somehow pulled out of there. Then the girl was attacked, and she resisted, as her father had taught her self-defense techniques. Amy fought back against the criminal and tried to escape. Her blood dripped onto the asphalt and smeared on the guardrail as she tried to climb over it. But unfortunately, Willard didn't manage to get far. She couldn't cope with the monster that attacked her, with his rage and anger. The investigators couldn't understand why the girl stopped on the highway shoulder in the middle of the night. Her car was in perfect condition, full tank of gas, all tires inflated, all systems working. Amy's father, a police sergeant, taught her to be vigilant. The girl, remembering her father's instruction, would never stop on the road without a good reason. The detectives considered several versions. The attacker could have been someone the girl knew, then she could have stopped to, for example, give him a ride. However, the scratch on the Honda's body suggested that the criminal intentionally rammed Amy's car, forcing her to stop as a result of an accident, and this version seemed more plausible. On June 23rd, Amy's loved ones saw her off on her final journey. About 4,000 people gathered for the memorial mass at the Catholic Church. The service time had to be extended so that all who wished could say goodbye to the deceased student and pay their respects. The line of mourners stretched hundreds of meters from the church entrance. Her university teammates built a canopy over Amy's coffin from their lacrosse sticks to honor her achievements in lacrosse. Sports were Willard's life, and now, after death, other athletes stood guard of honor by her coffin. Everyone was crying. They had truly lost a future star, lost a friend, a family member, and it was very hard to realize that no one would ever hear Amy Willard's happy, ringing laughter again. Everywhere there were flowers, candles, and photographs, as well as Amy's sports attributes, lacrosse sticks, and her team's jerseys. Another memorial was created at the highway exit, where local residents left flowers, notes, and cans of Coca-Cola, the deceased girl's favorite drink. Without any other suspects at that moment, the detectives returned to Andrew Kobach. They found out that the guy dreamed of joining the fire department, but wasn't accepted. Then Andrew decided to impersonate a police officer. His car had flashing lights installed, and in the interior, he kept a police scanner. According to friends' stories, the young man sometimes put on a police uniform and stopped law-abiding drivers who didn't suspect a trick. After high school, Andrew worked in several local bars and restaurants, but at the time of the attack on Amy, the guy was unemployed, so his story about returning after a shift at the bar was made up. Andrew, impersonating a police officer, could have stopped Amy's car at night and taken advantage of her willingness to obey the law. Kobach was called to the station to give a statement, and he allowed the officers to search his car without a warrant. During the search in the glove compartment, the detectives found a powerful flashlight and handcuffs. The car's interior was dirty, except for the rear part, which had apparently been recently cleaned. Sensing trouble, Andrew stopped the search and told the police he would hire a lawyer. However, the authorities were determined to see the case through. They obtained a warrant to search the house where Kobach lived and his car. The guy also had to provide a blood sample for a DNA test. Although Andrew denied any involvement in the attack on Amy and insisted on his innocence, the prosecutor was already ready to take the case to court. This story was in all the news. Previously, residents of the prestigious area had never encountered anything like this. Andrew's parents' house was searched. His car was towed to the forensic lab. But when the experts looked at the tires, they realized the wheels were different. Nothing was found in the car or at home that could help the investigation. By November, the case had reached a dead end again because Andrew's DNA didn't match the DNA found on Amy's body. The perpetrator's DNA profile wasn't in the Pennsylvania State Database at all. All suspicions were officially lifted from Andrew Kobach, although he fit the role of suspect in the attack on the student like no one else. Local residents, learning that someone could impersonate police officers, were concerned and outraged. The Pennsylvania senator had to introduce new laws prohibiting unmarked police cars from stopping vehicles for traffic violations. While the investigation was ongoing, another alarming incident occurred. On September 23rd, a woman contacted the police and reported an attack that happened on Interstate 476, on the same section of highway known as the Blue Route. She was driving when another vehicle forced her to pull over to the shoulder. A man in a ski mask and dark clothing opened her car door and pulled her from the driver's seat. The woman was injured. However, after studying the details, the detectives concluded that this attack was in no way related to the murder of Amy Willard. But now the investigators stuck to the version that the student could indeed have been attacked by a police officer or someone impersonating a law enforcement officer. Reviewing old cases, they discovered another incident that occurred in 1994, when a woman was stopped by a man with a flashing blue light on the roof of his car. He demanded her driver's license, but when she pointed out the absence of a police uniform, the stranger got angry and punched her in the face, then tried to pull her out of the car. Fortunately, the woman was able to fight back, break free, and drive away, but the criminal was never caught. The winter holidays passed, the new year, 1997, arrived, and there were still no answers to the question of who took the life of the young, promising athlete. The Willard case was shown in an episode of the show Unsolved Mysteries, but that didn't yield any results either. And shortly before the anniversary of Amy's death, a very strange coincidence occurred. In May 1997, 19-year-old student and nurse Patty Jordan was having fun at a party with friends at a nightclub. It was already past midnight when she said goodbye to everyone and headed home alone. On the way, the girl noticed bright headlights in the rearview mirror. An unfamiliar car was following her, getting very close. When Patty tried to pull away by running first a yellow and then a red light, the pursuer did the same. When the girl changed lanes or accelerated, the unknown car repeated the maneuvers until it hit the rear of her body. Patty was shocked when the driver approached her car at a traffic light and started yelling through the open window that she had crashed into his car. He gestured for her to pull over to the shoulder and stop, but the frightened girl continued driving and headed toward the police station. At that moment, the stranger cut her off and overtook her, so the student was able to see his license plate. It was Pennsylvania plates. Patty didn't stop because she sensed the danger emanating from the strange man. Returning home, she told everything to her father. By a strange coincidence, the girl's father also served in the police. He used the National Crime Information Center to check who the car with the license plate his daughter remembered was registered to. Further investigation showed that the car's owner was a 38-year-old black man named Arthur Bomar. Of course, this story immediately attracted the attention of the detectives handling Amy Willard's case. They checked this person's background and found out that he had a rich criminal history, including violence against women and intentional homicide. When Arthur was only 19 years old, he got into a fight over a parking spot with a man. Then, during the argument, Bomar pulled out a gun and shot his opponent. He was charged and sentenced to life imprisonment. However, Arthur was released from prison after just 11 years. For some inexplicable reason, the parole board thought it would be a good idea to release this monster into society. In 1990, he got out of prison and moved to Pennsylvania. Just a few months after his release, Bomar was back in prison after pulling a woman out of her own car and attacking her right on the street. He was arrested and was supposed to be sent back to prison in Nevada. But the woman he attacked died under circumstances unrelated to Arthur, so the case was dropped. The criminal was free again. The investigators tried to find Bomar, but he wasn't at home or at work, and no one knew where he was. Fortunately, the police didn't have to wait long because just a couple of weeks later, on June 5, 1997, a woman called 911 and reported an intruder trying to break into her apartment. When the police arrived, they found a man who introduced himself as Peter Tomislav, but fingerprints later confirmed that it was actually Arthur Bomar, who had given a different name. He was arrested on an outstanding warrant for violating parole conditions and criminal trespass. It turned out that Arthur was driving a stolen Honda. He had simply switched the license plate from his old Ford. The detectives found out that the Honda previously belonged to a 25-year-old young woman named Maria Cabuenas, who was missing. Her family reported her disappearance when Maria didn't show up for work. Her route passed along the same highway where Amy was driving when she was abducted. When the crime investigators conducted a thorough search of the stolen car, they immediately noticed damage on the rear bumper, and when they looked in the trunk, they found dried blood inside. The sample was immediately sent to the lab for analysis. Now, Arthur became the main suspect in the murder of Amy and the disappearance of Maria Cabuenas. The man denied any involvement in the attack on Amy Willard, and he refused to say anything at all because he knew that with an attack on a girl ending in death, he could face the death penalty. However, Arthur admitted that that night he was with friends at a birthday party. He didn't say anything more. Then the detectives tracked down Bomar's relatives and talked to them. Arthur's wife said that he knew the blue route on the interstate well. He even sometimes slept in his car on the highway's shoulder. During the attack on Amy on June 19, 1996, her husband, according to his wife, was absent for a couple of days, so she didn't know what he was doing during that time. Bomar's stepbrother also shared interesting information. He mentioned that on weekends, they constantly went to Smokey Joe's, and Arthur used various ways to approach women. He could spill a drink on them, supposedly by accident, arrange an intentional collision with a car in the parking lot to start a conversation. In addition to his wife, Arthur had a mistress, Mary. The girl didn't know the man was married, and the investigators opened her eyes to that. Naturally, Mary got upset and started telling what Bomar had told her. So, Arthur saw Amy at Smokey Joe's bar when she was getting into her car. Since the girl was alone, the man followed her in his Ford. On the blue route, he cut off her car and ordered her to stop, showing a fake police badge. Amy got angry and doubted that Bomar was a real police officer. This infuriated Arthur. In response, the man hit the girl, causing her to lose consciousness. He pulled her out of the car and put her in his vehicle. Then he drove to an abandoned building, assaulted her, and hit her on the head with something heavy. To avoid leaving evidence, Arthur put Amy's clothes in a trash bag and threw it away elsewhere, and dragged the body and left it at the vacant lot. This could have been a breakthrough in the case if the same information hadn't been published in the media earlier. Unfortunately, the offended girl's words meant nothing without supporting evidence. The DNA test results weren't ready yet, so the detectives decided to find the car Arthur Bomar was in on the night of the attack on Amy Willard. From the insurance company records, the investigators learned that the Ford had been in an accident and towed to a junkyard. Experts confirmed that the tire treads matched the wheel prints at the crime scene, but there was no evidence in the form of blood or DNA inside the car. Because it had stood without a roof for several months, everything inside was destroyed by various weather conditions. Moreover, Arthur had worked in a hospital for some time and surely knew how to get rid of bloodstains. The detectives didn't give up and dismantled the car into parts. Once again, more carefully studying the photos and examining the cross-shaped marks on Amy's body, they concluded that at some point, the perpetrator's car drove over the girl's remains and stopped in the area of her chest and abdomen. The thing is, the oil pan of the car had exactly the same pattern as the thermal burns on Amy's body. When the investigators removed one of the door panels, they saw brown drops resembling blood on the metal part. Experts took a sample for analysis and sent it to the lab to determine the DNA profile. All that remained was to wait for the expert results. The expert's report provided the necessary evidence to press charges. The blood found in the trunk of the Honda stolen from Maria matched the owner's DNA, and the blood found on the door panel of the old Ford matched Amy Willard's DNA. The DNA extracted from the semen during the girl's autopsy confirmed Arthur Bomar's involvement in her murder. On December 10, 1997, Arthur, already in custody, was charged. However, despite the irrefutable evidence, the man refused to admit his guilt. A month later, he tried to commit suicide in his prison cell using a bed sheet, but the fabric couldn't hold his weight, and in the end, Bomar survived. Arthur faced the death penalty, but Gail Willard, Amy's mom, stated in the media that this man's death wouldn't resurrect her daughter. The woman didn't want Bomar's parents to experience the same pain she did, losing their child. It's worth noting that Gail showed compassion not to the criminal himself, but to his relatives. On the other hand, Amy's father, Paul, said that when the time comes to carry out Arthur's death sentence, he would like to sit in the front row. Bomar's trial was scheduled for September 1998. The trial attracted heightened media attention. The courtroom was filled with spectators. Amy's loved ones sat in the front rows. The family and friends wore specially designed T-shirts with a large sunflower on the chest in memory of the deceased, similar to the one the girl wore on the night of her tragic death. The sunflower became a symbol of Amy's life and hope for justice. Unfortunately, the judge believed that in this way, the relatives and friends could influence the jury, so they were asked to remove the sunflower T-shirts, cover them with other clothing, or leave the courtroom altogether. This was very unpleasant because besides the T-shirts, the prosecution had more substantial evidence, such as DNA, but those present had to comply. Some simply turned their clothes inside out, others threw on coats to simply cover the sunflowers. However, this didn't save Arthur Bomar from a guilty verdict and the death penalty. Throughout the trial, the defendant had to be restrained due to frequent outbursts of anger. After the judge read the verdict, Bomar even folded his fingers imitating a gun and pointed it at Amy's relatives sitting in the front row. Judging by his behavior, this person shouldn't have been released from prison at all. Arthur's relatives also didn't behave in the best way. Many members of his family were very upset by this outcome of the case. They were more concerned about Arthur's life than the fact that a young student had suffered at his hands, and possibly several other people. When the relatives left the courtroom, reporters approached them. Not wanting to communicate with the press, they rudely pushed the correspondents away. And Arthur's mother even tried to hit one of them with her cane. As they say, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Meanwhile, Maria Cabuenas was still listed as missing. 3 months after Arthur's sentencing, in January 1999, a man walking his dog in a field accidentally stumbled upon a human skull. DNA showed that these remains belonged to Maria. The cause of her death was blunt head trauma, just like Amy's. Unfortunately, Arthur Bomar was never charged with the woman's murder. Because he was already on death row, the authorities saw no point in it. although the investigators were sure that Bomar was guilty of Maria's death. A person has three enemies: the world, consisting of people who often use freedom for evil; the devil, who sometimes comes with faith; and one's own flesh, which out of boredom and excessive freedom tends to cause harm and damage to oneself or others. Only the person has the choice, to let enemies get close or to keep them under special control. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.